Hello, friends. I'm here to help you relax tonight. Tell me where you're listening from and what time is it there. I'd love to know. Now get comfortable. Let go of the day's worries and let this story guide you to a calm and peaceful sleep. You deserve to feel at ease and leave all the stress behind. Subscribe now and join me for more stories to help you find peace every night. Story 1. It started with a phone call, a late-night ring that sliced through the quiet like a scream. Sam didn't recognize the number, but something about the timing, the way it pulsed insistently, made it impossible to ignore. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the glowing screen, the thought crossing his mind, what if I didn't pick up? But he did. Hello? His voice wavered, and the other end was a silence so heavy it felt like static pressing against his ear. He almost hung up, annoyed, but then there was a sound, soft, deliberate breathing. Sam? It wasn't a question. It was a statement spoken in a voice that felt wrong. Too close, too knowing, and yet unfamiliar. Who is this? He demanded, his voice firmer now, but inside, his pulse was racing. You shouldn't have answered. The line went dead. Sam stared at the screen, feeling his stomach twist. He told himself it was a prank, a stupid, elaborate prank, but that voice, the way it said his name, stuck with him. He put the phone down and tried to shake it off. Still, something had shifted in the room. The air felt heavier, the shadows sharper. He glanced at the corners of his room, at the dim light from the hallway spilling through the crack in his door. Everything seemed off, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. When he finally went to bed, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every gust of wind outside seemed like a whisper. He told himself it was just his nerves, but the unease stayed, coiling tighter as the night dragged on. At 3:12 a.m., Sam woke with a start. He wasn't sure what had pulled him from sleep, but his skin was clammy, his heart racing. For a moment, he thought it was a nightmare. But then he heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the window. He froze, staring at the glass. His curtains were drawn, but the sound was steady, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Just a branch, he thought. It was just the wind. But the rationalization felt hollow. Finally, gathering his courage, he reached over and yanked the curtain open. The window was empty, just his dark backyard staring back at him. But the tapping hadn't stopped. It was coming from inside. Sam's throat went dry. He turned, and there it was, a pale hand pressed against the other side of the glass. Except it wasn't a reflection. It was a hand. The skin was ashen, fingers impossibly long, and it left streaks on the glass as it moved, like condensation on a winter window. Sam scrambled back, nearly falling out of bed as the hand disappeared. The room fell silent again, but that only made it worse. He wanted to run, to leave the house, but his legs wouldn't move. His breaths were shallow, and his mind raced through the possibilities. He needed to convince himself it wasn't real. Then the phone rang again. The sound jolted him out of his paralysis, and he snatched it up without thinking, more out of fear than logic. Who is this? He hissed into the phone. This time the voice was different, hoarse, rasping. You didn't lock the back door? Sam's blood turned to ice. He stood frozen for a moment, the words repeating in his mind like a broken record. You didn't lock the back door. He spun toward the bedroom door, his eyes wide and wild. The faint glow of the hallway light seemed distant now, like a fragile barrier between him and something waiting. He forced his legs to move, each step toward the door feeling like wading through quicksand. He reached for the doorknob, but his hand trembled. Slowly, he pushed the door open, peering out into the hallway. The house was silent, too silent. He crept down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath his feet making him flinch. When he reached the kitchen, his eyes darted to the back door. It was open, not just unlocked, open. The night outside looked impossibly dark, and the cool air seeped in, carrying with it a strange, faint smell. It was metallic, sharp. What? Sam's breaths quickened, and his hands trembled as he reached for the door to close it. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something just outside. Footprints. They weren't shoe prints or even bare feet. The impressions in the dirt were strange, elongated, with too many toes, and they trailed off into the woods behind the house. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely think. He turned to leave the kitchen, but something stopped him in his tracks. There was a sound behind him. Not a tap this time. It was a low, guttural noise like a growl, but it wasn't coming from any animal he'd ever heard. Slowly, he turned, and his eyes fell on the sliding glass door that led to the patio. There was something standing there. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its silhouette was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an angle that looked wrong, as though its neck was broken. Sam couldn't move. His body felt like it was rooted to the spot, his mind screaming at him to run, to do anything but stand there. The thing raised a hand, pressing it against. The smile wasn't natural. It stretched too wide, showing teeth that didn't belong in any living creature's mouth. They were jagged, mismatched, and too many to count. Sam stumbled back, his hands searching blindly for anything he could use to defend himself, but his brain was paralyzed with fear. The thing outside didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting slowly from one side to the other, like it was studying him, testing him. Then it lifted a finger and tapped the glass. Tap. Sam's breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to echo inside his skull. He wanted to scream, but his voice felt trapped, strangled by the sheer terror gripping him. Tap. The second tap was slower, deliberate, and the creature's smile widened, as if it knew exactly how much fear it was causing. Finally, Sam found his voice. "What do you want?" he shouted, his words shaking as much as his body. The creature didn't answer. It pressed its face closer to the glass, the skin pale and almost translucent in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were black pits, empty and endless. And then, as if responding to his question, it raised its hand and pointed. Not at the door. Not at the window. It pointed at him. Sam's stomach churned. The air seemed to grow colder, and a suffocating pressure filled the room. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. His survival instincts finally kicked in, and he bolted toward the front door. The thing outside didn't follow, at least not that he could hear. But that only made his fear worse. Was it waiting for him to open the door? Was it already inside? He reached the front door and fumbled with the locks, his fingers slipping on the cold metal. Finally, the door swung open, and he ran out into the night, not caring where he was going as long as it was away from the house. The neighborhood was eerily quiet. No lights in any of the windows, no sounds of crickets or wind, just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He ran until his lungs burned, finally stopping under a street lamp several blocks away. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone, but when he looked at the screen, his heart sank. No service. He stared at the phone, panic bubbling up again. That wasn't possible. He'd had full bars earlier. He tried dialing anyway, but the call wouldn't go through. And then the phone buzzed. It wasn't a call this time. It was a notification, one he didn't want to see. Unknown sender, look behind you. His breath hitched. He didn't want to turn around. Every fiber of his being screamed at him not to look, but the pull was irresistible. Slowly he turned, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The street behind him was empty. At least it looked empty at first. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it, standing at the far end of the street, just barely visible under the faint glow of another street lamp. The creature. It hadn't moved like he expected. It hadn't chased him or jumped out of the shadows. He just stood there watching, waiting. Sam's legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to move, breaking into a run again. He didn't know where he was going, just that he had to keep going. He turned corner after corner, his feet pounding against the pavement, until he finally reached an old gas station on the edge of town. The lights inside were still on, and the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs felt like a lifeline. He burst through the doors, gasping for air. The attendant behind the counter looked up, startled. He was an older man with graying hair and tired eyes. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. Sam tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He stumbled to the counter, gripping it for support. "Please," he finally managed to choke out. "You have to help me. There's something following me." The man frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "What are you talking about? Did someone try to hurt you?" Sam shook his head violently. "No, it's not someone. I don't know what it is, but it's outside. It's been watching me." The man held up a hand, trying to calm him down. Okay. Take a breath. Let's see what's going on. He walked over to the window and peered out into the night. Sam stood frozen, every muscle in his body tense. Well, I don't see anything, the man said after a moment. Sam's heart sank. No, it's there. It's out there. I saw it. The man turned back to him, his expression softening. Listen, kid, maybe you just need to sit down for a bit. You look like you've been through hell. Let me get you some water. Sam wanted to argue, but his throat was dry, and the thought of water sounded almost too good to pass up. He nodded reluctantly. The man disappeared into the back room, leaving Sam alone. The gas station felt eerily quiet, the hum of the lights suddenly seeming too loud. And then he heard it. His blood ran cold. He turned slowly toward the window. The creature was there, standing just outside the glass, its face pressed against it, that horrible smile plastered across its features. Sam stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing didn't move, didn't try to break in, it just stood there watching him. And then, as Sam's terror reached its peak, it did something he hadn't expected. It raised its hand and pointed. Not at him this time. At the back room. Sam's breath caught as he stared at the thing pointing toward the back room. His mind raced, desperate to understand what it wanted, what it meant. The old man had gone back there just moments ago. Sam's instincts screamed at him to run, but the guilt of leaving someone else to face whatever this was held him frozen. Hey? Sam called, his voice trembling. Are you okay back there? No response. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Sam's legs moved on their own, shaky and hesitant, as he crept toward the door to the back room. The creature outside didn't stop him. It didn't even move. It simply watched, its smile stretching unnaturally wider. Sam's hand hovered over the doorknob. His heart pounded so loudly it was all he could hear. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The fluorescent light inside flickered weakly, casting strange shadows across the storage shelves. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, some toppled over, spilling their contents onto the floor. Hello? Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. Something clattered in the far corner of the room. He flinched, his pulse spiking. Sir? He called again, louder this time, hoping for any kind of answer. Still nothing. He stepped further inside, his shoes crunching over broken glass. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the attendant. The air smelled stale, heavy with the faint scent of gasoline and something metallic. What? Sam froze as he spotted it, a dark, viscous trail smeared across the floor, leading deeper into the shadows. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to follow it, his breath shallow and uneven. The trail ended behind a row of shelves, and as Sam turned the corner, his worst fears were confirmed. The old man lay crumpled on the floor, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His chest wasn't moving. Blood pooled around him, seeping into the cracks in the tile. Sam staggered back, a strangled gasp escaping his throat. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His mind reeled, struggling to process what he was seeing. And then the body moved. There wasn't a twitch or a spasm. It was deliberate, unnatural. The man's head turned slowly, the bones in his neck cracking as if they hadn't moved in years. His lifeless eyes locked onto Sam's, and a grotesque smile spread across his face. Sam, the man rasped, his voice low and distorted. Sam stumbled back, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. No, this isn't real, he muttered, scrambling to his feet. The man, or whatever it was now, began to rise. His movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as if he wasn't fully in control of his own body. You can't run, the thing said, its voice warping, overlapping with something else. Something inhuman. Sam bolted, his survival instincts taking over. He burst out of the back room, slamming the door behind him. The creature outside the gas station was gone, but the oppressive feeling it left behind still lingered. Sam didn't stop to think. He ran out of the gas station and into the night, his legs carrying him as far away as they could. He didn't know where he was going, all he knew was that he couldn't stop. The streets blurred together as he ran, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What was happening? Why him? And most importantly, how was he going to survive this? Finally, he found himself in a park on the edge of town. The empty playground and overgrown grass felt eerie under the pale moonlight, but it was the only place he could think to stop and catch his breath. He collapsed onto a bench, his chest heaving as he tried to calm down. But the silence around him was deafening, and every shadow seemed to shift in the corner of his eye. Then his phone buzzed. He hesitated, dread pooling in his stomach as he pulled it out. The screen displayed another message from the unknown sender. "You can't escape." Sam's hands trembled as he stared at the words. Before he could process them, the phone buzzed again. "Look to your right." His head snapped toward the right before he could stop himself. A figure stood at the edge of the playground, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated, with limbs that didn't seem to fit together. Sam's breath hitched. He didn't need to see its face to know what it was. He took a step forward. Sam leapt to his feet and backed away, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body frozen in fear. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring his terror. "You're wasting time." The voice came from behind him. Sam spun around, but no one was there. The creature in front of him stopped, tilting its head in that unnerving way as if it were mocking him. Sam's survival instincts kicked in again, and he bolted toward the tree line, hoping the dense woods would provide some kind of cover. The branches scratched at his skin, and the uneven ground made it hard to run, but he didn't stop. Behind him, he heard the sound of footsteps. Not running, but walking, slow, heavy, and deliberate. No matter how far he ran, the footsteps stayed the same distance behind him. Finally, he burst out of the woods and onto a narrow road. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like they were about to give out, but he forced himself to keep going. In the distance, he saw headlights approaching. A car. He stumbled into the road, waving his arms frantically. "Stop. Please stop." The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged woman, jumped out. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Sam didn't answer. He just pointed toward the woods, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. There's something, it's following me." The woman's expression shifted from concern to confusion. She glanced toward the woods but saw nothing. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but you're clearly not okay. Get in the car. I'll take you to the police." Sam hesitated for a moment, but the sound of footsteps emerging from the woods made the decision for him. He climbed into the car, slamming the door behind him. As the woman drove off, Sam glanced back toward the woods. For a moment he thought he was safe, but then he saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, its black eyes locked onto him, and it smiled. The car's engine hummed as it sped down the dark, empty road. Sam sat in the passenger seat, his chest heaving with every breath, his eyes fixed on the side mirror. He half expected the creature to be running behind them, its grotesque smile glowing in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods receding into the distance. The driver, a woman with short-cropped hair and a steady grip on the wheel, glanced at him. "You need to tell me what's going on," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What are you running from?" Sam's mind raced. How could he explain it? That he was being hunted by something that defied all logic? He shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't know what it is. It's not human, I can tell you that. It killed someone at the gas station, and it's been following me ever since." The woman frowned, her knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "Not human? Are you sure you're not just shaken up? Sometimes when people are scared, I'm not imagining this." Sam snapped, his voice breaking. "It's real." It pointed at me. It knew my name. The woman fell silent for a moment, her eyes flicking between the road and Sam's pale, terrified face. Finally she sighed. "Okay, let's just get to the nearest police station. You can explain everything there." Sam nodded numbly, his gaze returning to the mirror. For a moment, the silence in the car felt almost comforting. But then the radio crackled to life. It wasn't music or a broadcast. It was static, faint at first but quickly growing louder. The woman reached for the dial, frowning. "That's odd." "I didn't." A voice cut through the static. Low, distorted, and chilling. "Sam?" His blood turned to ice. The woman's hand froze on the dial. "Did that just keep driving?" Sam shouted, his voice sharp with panic. The static grew louder, the voice repeating his name over and over, each time more distorted. The headlights flickered, and the car shuddered as if something heavy had landed on it. "What the hell?" the woman yelled, gripping the wheel tightly as the car swerved. Sam's eyes darted to the windshield, and his heart stopped. The creature was there, clinging to the hood of the car. Its face was pressed against the glass, its too wide smile and black, endless eyes staring directly at him. "Brake!" Sam screamed. The woman slammed on the brakes and the car screeched to a halt. The creature flew off the hood, landing in the middle of the road with an unnatural thud. "Stay here," the woman ordered, throwing the car into park. "No, don't get out," Sam shouted, but it was too late. The woman stepped out of the car, her flashlight in hand. She aimed it at the figure lying in the road. "Hey, are you hurt? Do you need—" The creature's head snapped up, and it rose to its feet in one fluid, unnatural motion. Sam's heart pounded as he watched the woman freeze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. What are you?" she whispered. The creature tilted its head, that horrible smile widening. "You shouldn't have stopped," it said, its voice a distorted echo. Before Sam could react, the creature lunged at her. Its movements were impossibly fast, and the last thing he saw was her flashlight hitting the ground before the darkness consumed her. "No," Sam shouted, scrambling out of the car. But the road was empty. No creature. No woman. Just the flashlight, lying shattered on the asphalt. Sam's legs threatened to give out, but he forced himself to move. He grabbed the flashlight and swung it around, scanning the shadows for any sign of what had happened. Then the car door slammed shut behind him. Sam whipped around, his heart in his throat. The car's interior lights flickered, and the engine roared to life, but no one was behind the wheel. The car sped toward him. Sam barely had time to dive out of the way as it hurtled past, disappearing down the road. He lay on the cold asphalt, his chest heaving, the flashlight still clutched in his trembling hand. For a moment, everything was silent again. No footsteps, no static, just the faint hum of the wind through the trees. And then his phone buzzed. He didn't want to look at it. Every message so far had only brought more terror. But his shaking hands betrayed him, and he pulled it out. "Unknown sender, you're wasting time." Sam stared at the message, his breath catching in his throat. Another buzz followed. "Unknown sender, it's closer than you think." Panic surged through him as he glanced around, the flashlight beam darting through the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But then he felt it. A presence. Cold air brushed the back of his neck, and an overwhelming sense of dread rooted him in place. Slowly, as if compelled by something beyond his control, he turned around. The creature was there, inches from his face. Its smile was gone now, replaced by something far worse, an expression of pure, unrelenting hunger. "You can't run forever," it whispered. Sam's scream tore through the night as the creature reached for him, its fingers elongating into claws. But before it could touch him, a blinding light flooded the road. A truck barreled down the street, its horn blaring. The creature recoiled, disappearing into the shadows as the truck skidded to a halt. The driver, a burly man with a weathered face, jumped out. "Are you insane? What are you doing in the middle of the road?" Sam didn't answer. He couldn't. His body was frozen, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "Hey kid," the man barked, shaking his shoulder. "Snap out of it." Sam's eyes finally focused on him, and he managed to croak out, "Help me, please." The man frowned, but something in Sam's voice must have convinced him. "Get in. I'll take you into town." Sam climbed into the truck, his hands still trembling. As the vehicle rumbled to life and pulled away, he glanced out the window, half expecting to see the creature again. But the road was empty. For now. The truck rumbled along the dark highway, its headlights cutting through the oppressive blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Sam sat in the passenger seat, his body pressed against the door, his eyes flicking nervously to the side mirror every few seconds. The driver, who had introduced himself as Frank, kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his thermos of coffee. He was a large, rugged man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes, but there was something comforting about his steady presence. "You look like you've been through hell," Frank said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Mind telling me what's going on?" Sam hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he could say without sounding completely insane. "There's something out there," he said finally. "Something that's been following me." Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't laugh or dismiss him. "Something? Like a person?" "No," Sam said quickly, his voice trembling. "Not a person. I don't even know what it is, but it's not human." Frank grunted, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the road ahead. "You sure you didn't hit your head or something?" People see all kinds of weird stuff when they're in shock. I'm not imagining this, Sam said, his voice rising. I've seen it. It killed someone, 2 people, maybe more. And it's not going to stop until it gets me. Frank was silent for a long moment, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Finally, he sighed and took a long sip of his coffee. All right, he said, let's say I believe you. What's the plan? You got a safe place to go? Someone you can call? Sam shook his head. No, I don't even know why this is happening. I need to figure out what it wants. Frank frowned but didn't press further. Well, we'll get to town soon. Maybe someone there can help you. The truck's cabin fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sam stared out the window, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts and unanswered questions. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like it was moving, and every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Then the radio crackled. Sam flinched, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced at Frank, who was fiddling with the dial. Damn thing's been acting up all night, Frank muttered. But Sam wasn't convinced. His pulse quickened as the static grew louder, a faint voice rising beneath it. Sam? His blood ran cold. Did you hear that? Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank frowned. Hear what? The voice came again, clearer this time. Sam? It's waiting. Sam's breath hitched. He grabbed Frank's arm, his eyes wide with terror. Turn it off. Turn the radio off. Frank looked at him like he was crazy but reached over and switched the radio off. The static disappeared, leaving only the sound of the engine. There, Frank said. It's off. You okay? Sam didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. The headlights flickered. Frank cursed under his breath. Damn truck's got an electrical problem. Happens sometimes. But Sam wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead. Something was standing in the middle of it. Stop the truck, Sam whispered. Frank squinted, leaning forward to get a better look. What the hell is that? The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were studying them. Frank slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a halt just a few feet from the figure. Stay in the truck, Frank ordered, reaching for the rifle mounted on the back window. No, Sam said, grabbing his arm. You can't go out there. That's it. That's the thing that's been following me. Frank shook him off. I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but I'm not letting some weirdo block the road. He climbed out of the truck, slamming the door behind him. Sam watched in horror as Frank approached the figure, the rifle raised. Hey, Frank shouted. You need to get out of the road. The figure didn't move. I'm not gonna ask you again, Frank warned, his voice steady. And then it moved. Not like a person. No, its movements were jerky and wrong, as if it were a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. It took one slow, deliberate step toward Frank. What the hell? Frank muttered, his grip on the rifle tightening. Sam wanted to scream, to warn him, but his voice was stuck in his throat. The figure stopped a few feet from Frank, its head tilting even further to one side. And then it smiled. Frank froze. What are you? Before he could finish, the figure lunged. Its movements were impossibly fast, and in the blink of an eye, it was on him. Sam turned away, covering his ears as Frank's screams filled the night. When the noise stopped, he looked back. The figure was gone. So was Frank. The rifle lay abandoned in the middle of the road, bent and twisted as if it had been crushed. Sam's stomach churned, but he forced himself to move. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys still in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Sam slammed his foot on the gas. The truck sped down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Sam's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing him. But the road behind him was empty. For now. The truck roared down the highway, the engine growling like a beast desperate to outrun the shadows chasing it. Sam's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in the mirrors, refusing to see if the creature was still following. It didn't matter. He could feel it. The truck's cabin was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the asphalt. Sam tried to steady his breathing, to focus on the road, but his mind was a whirlwind of terror and unanswered questions. What was that thing? Why was it after him? And most importantly, how could he stop it? The faint glow of a gas station sign appeared on the horizon, its flickering neon letters promising fuel, food, and sanctuary. Sam hesitated. Stopping felt like a death sentence, but the truck's fuel gauge hovered just above empty. He had no choice. As he pulled into the station, the eerie quiet of the night pressed against his ears. The place was deserted, the single streetlight in the lot casting long, unsettling shadows. Sam parked near the pump, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was cold, biting through his thin jacket. He glanced around, half expecting the creature to appear from the darkness. But the lot was empty. He grabbed the pump handle with trembling hands and began to fill the tank. The sound of fuel rushing into the tank was almost comforting, a reminder of something normal in a night that was anything but. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails dragging against metal. Sam froze, his eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The sound was coming from the other side of the pump. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. No response. He put the pump back and took a cautious step toward the noise. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck and leave, but curiosity, or maybe sheer desperation, pushed him forward. As he rounded the pump, he saw a figure crouched by the side of the building. It was a man, his clothes tattered, his hair a matted mess. He was clawing at the wall, his nails leaving deep gouges in the wood. "Hey!" Sam shouted, relief flooding him. "Are you okay?" The man stopped scratching and turned slowly. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his face pale and gaunt. He stared at Sam with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice hoarse and broken. Sam took a step back. "What do you mean? What's going on?" The man shook his head violently, his movements jerky and erratic. "It's too late. Once it marks you, it doesn't stop. It never stops." Sam's stomach twisted. "You've seen it?" The man let out a bitter laugh, the sound tinged with hysteria. "Seen it? I've been running from it for years. But you're fresh meat. It'll have fun with you." Before Sam could respond, the man's eyes widened, and his laughter stopped abruptly. He looked past Sam, his expression twisting into one of pure terror. "It's here," the man whispered. Sam didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel it. The oppressive weight of its presence, the cold that seeped into his bones. "Run," the man hissed, scrambling to his feet. "Run while you still can." But Sam's legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, as if compelled by some unseen force, he turned around. The creature stood at the edge of the lot, its black eyes glinting in the dim light. That horrible smile stretched across its face, wider than before, as if it were enjoying the fear radiating from him. Sam stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The creature tilted its head, its smile never faltering. "You," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. Sam's blood turned to ice. He turned and ran, sprinting toward the truck. His fingers fumbled with the door handle, his panic making him clumsy. Finally, he managed to yank the door open and throw himself inside. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, its tires screeching against the pavement. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature standing in the middle of the lot, watching him go. But it didn't chase him. That was almost worse. Sam drove for what felt like hours, his hands trembling on the wheel. The highway stretched on endlessly, the dark forest on either side pressing in like a suffocating shroud. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He didn't want to look at it. Every message so far had only brought more dread. But he couldn't ignore it. With a shaking hand, he picked it up. "Unknown sender, you're running out of time." Sam's breath hitched. Another buzz followed. "Unknown sender, the more you run, the stronger it gets." "What does that mean?" Sam muttered, his voice shaking. Before he could think further, the truck's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Sam said, panic rising in his chest. He hit the dashboard as if that would help. The engine died, and the truck coasted to a stop on the side of the road. The silence was deafening. Sam sat there, his hands gripping the wheel, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He reached for his phone, desperate for some kind of guidance, but the screen was blank. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the passenger side window. Sam turned slowly, his stomach churning with dread. The window was fogged up, but he could see the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. And then the face appeared. The creature's grin was wider than ever, its black eyes boring into his. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Sam screamed and scrambled out of the truck, his feet slipping on the gravel. He ran into the forest, branches clawing at his skin as he pushed through the undergrowth. The laughter followed him, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. Sam tripped and fell, landing hard on the ground. He rolled onto his back, his chest heaving as he looked around wildly. The creature stood over him, its smile stretching impossibly wide. "You can't escape," it said. Sam closed his eyes, bracing for the end. And then, silence. When he opened his eyes, the creature was gone. The forest was still, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. But Sam knew it wasn't over. It was never over. Sam stumbled out of the forest, his legs weak and trembling, his breath ragged. The road stretched before him, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the endless dark. He had no idea where he was or how far he had run, but the one thing he knew for certain was that the creature was still out there. It always was. The distant hum of an engine broke the silence. Sam turned toward the sound, his heart leaping with both hope and fear. A pair of headlights appeared, growing brighter as a car approached. Sam waved his arms frantically, stumbling into the middle of the road. "Stop. Please stop," he shouted, his voice hoarse. The car screeched to a halt just inches from him, the bright beams blinding him momentarily. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out, her silhouette framed by the light. "What the hell are you doing in the middle of the road?" she demanded, her tone sharp. Sam raised a hand to shield his eyes, trying to steady his breath. "Please, I need help. There's something after me." The woman hesitated, her expression softening as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Are you hurt?" she asked, stepping closer. "No, but we have to go. Now," Sam said urgently. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the creature emerging from the shadows. The woman frowned but didn't argue. "Get in," she said, motioning toward the car. Sam didn't need to be told twice. He climbed into the passenger seat, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the seatbelt. The woman got back behind the wheel, her eyes darting to him nervously. "What's your name?" she asked as she pulled back onto the road. "Sam," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Rachel," she said, her tone softening. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" Sam hesitated, unsure of how much to say. How could he explain something he didn't even understand himself? "There's something chasing me," he said finally. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human. It's been following me for days." Rachel glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "Not human? What do you mean?" "I don't know," Sam said, his voice rising. It's not like anything I've ever seen. And it doesn't stop. It never stops." Rachel was silent for a moment, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's just get to the next town. We'll figure it out from there." Sam nodded, though he wasn't sure there was anything to figure out. He leaned his head against the window, his body heavy with exhaustion. For a while, the drive was uneventful. The highway stretched on, the dense forest on either side a wall of impenetrable black. Rachel kept glancing at Sam, her concern evident, but she didn't press him further. Then the car radio crackled to life. Sam tensed, his eyes snapping open. The static was faint at first, a soft hum beneath the sound of the engine. But it grew louder, more insistent. Rachel frowned, reaching for the dial. "Stupid thing's been acting up all week," she muttered. Sam grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice shaking. Rachel looked at him, confused. "It's just static." But Sam knew better. The static shifted, forming words that sent a chill down his spine. "Sam?" Rachel's eyes widened. "Did it just say your name?" Sam nodded, his heart pounding. "It's here." The car's headlights flickered, plunging them into brief darkness before coming back on. Rachel slammed on the brakes, her hands gripping the wheel. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded. Before Sam could answer, the car lurched violently to one side. The tires screeched as Rachel fought to keep control, but the car spun out, skidding off the road and crashing into a ditch. The impact knocked the breath out of Sam. He groaned, clutching his side as he looked around. The windshield was cracked, and the hood of the car was crumpled like a discarded soda can. Rachel was slumped over the wheel, her hair covering her face. "Rachel?" Sam said, shaking her shoulder. "Are you okay?" She groaned, lifting her head. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was weak. "What the hell was that?" Sam didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the road ahead, where the creature stood, its silhouette illuminated by the flickering headlights. It smiled. "Get out of the car," Sam said urgently, unbuckling his seatbelt. Rachel followed his gaze, her eyes widening. "What is that?" "No time to explain. Just move." They scrambled out of the car, their movements clumsy and panicked. The creature watched them, its head tilting to one side as if amused by their fear. "Run," Sam said, grabbing Rachel's arm. They bolted into the forest, the undergrowth tearing at their clothes and skin. The laughter followed them, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. Rachel stumbled, her foot catching on a root. Sam pulled her up, his grip tight. "Keep moving," he shouted. But the creature was faster. It darted through the trees, its movements impossibly fluid and inhuman. Rachel screamed as it appeared in front of them, its grin stretching wider. "Leave us alone," Sam shouted, stepping between Rachel and the creature. The creature's smile faltered, its head tilting in curiosity. "You think you can stop me?" it said, its voice a low, mocking growl. Sam's hands clenched into fists, his fear replaced by a surge of anger. "Why me?" he demanded. "What do you want from me?" The creature's eyes glinted with malice. "You," it said simply. "Your fear. Your suffering. It feeds me." Sam's blood turned to ice. Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We have to go." But Sam didn't move. He stared at the creature, his mind racing. If fear was what it wanted, maybe that was the key. "You're not real," Sam said, his voice trembling but defiant. The creature's smile faltered again. "You're just in my head," Sam continued, his voice growing stronger. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The creature let out a low growl, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Sam, what are you doing?" Rachel whispered, her grip on his arm tightening. "I'm taking back control," Sam said, his eyes never leaving the creature. The creature lunged, its movements a blur. But instead of running, Sam stood his ground, his fists clenched. And then, it stopped. The creature froze in midair, its form dissolving into smoke. The forest grew silent, the oppressive weight lifting. Sam exhaled, his body sagging with relief. "Is it gone?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sam said honestly. But for the first time in days he felt hope. The quiet didn't last. Sam and Rachel stood in the clearing, their breaths visible in the cold air, their bodies trembling, not just from exhaustion but from the deep-seated fear that the reprieve was only temporary. Sam's mind raced. He'd stared the creature down, confronted his terror, and for a brief moment, it had vanished. But was it truly gone, or just waiting for its next move? Rachel broke the silence, her voice low and shaky. "Sam, what the hell was that thing?" Sam didn't answer immediately. He bent over, hands on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. He was as clueless as she was, but there was no denying one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't bound by the rules of their world. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "But it said it feeds on fear. That's why it's after me." Rachel frowned, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Feeds on fear? You mean, it's like a parasite or something?" "Something like that," Sam said. He straightened up, brushing dirt from his clothes. "But I think I might have stopped it. At least for now." Rachel shook her head, looking around the dark forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. "This doesn't feel over," she said quietly. Sam couldn't argue with that. The oppressive weight of the creature's presence might have lifted, but an unease lingered in the air, like the calm before a storm. "We need to keep moving," Sam said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion tugging at him. "We can't stay here." Rachel hesitated but nodded. "Which way?" Sam looked around, his sense of direction utterly scrambled. Every path looked the same, and the thick undergrowth made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "I don't know," he admitted. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Great. So we're lost in the middle of nowhere, being hunted by whatever that thing was." Sam ignored the bitterness in her tone and started walking. "Staying still isn't an option. Let's go." Reluctantly, Rachel followed. They walked in silence, the forest around them eerily still. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were absent. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old dirt road. Sam stopped, his eyes scanning the narrow path. It looked abandoned, overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen branches. "Better than nothing," Rachel said, stepping onto the road. Sam hesitated. Something about the road felt wrong, though he couldn't explain why. But Rachel was already moving, and he wasn't about to let her go alone. The road twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches casting grotesque shadows in the faint moonlight. "Do you hear that?" Rachel asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Sam strained his ears. At first he heard nothing, but then it came, a faint rhythmic sound like a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead, growing louder with each step they took. "What is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Sam said, his gut twisting with unease. They rounded a bend, and the source of the sound came into view, an old, decrepit cabin. Its wooden walls were warped and weathered, the windows shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The thumping sound was louder now, echoing from somewhere inside. "No way," Rachel said, shaking her head. "We're not going in there." Sam didn't argue. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to find another way. But as they stood there, the forest behind them seemed to darken, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. "We don't have a choice," Sam said finally. Rachel stared at him, disbelief etched on her face. "You're insane." "Maybe," Sam admitted. "But staying out here isn't any safer." With that, he stepped toward the cabin, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Rachel followed reluctantly, her every movement radiating tension. The cabin door creaked as Sam pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. The inside was just as dilapidated as the exterior, dust-covered furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and an overwhelming sense of decay. The thumping sound was louder now, coming from beneath the floorboards. Rachel looked at Sam, her face pale. "This is a bad idea." Sam nodded. "Yeah, but we're already here." They followed the sound to the center of the room, where a large, weathered rug covered the floor. Sam knelt down, hesitating for a moment before pulling the rug aside. Beneath it was a trapdoor. The thumping was deafening now, as if something alive was trapped below. "Don't open it," Rachel said, her voice trembling. But Sam couldn't stop himself. Something compelled him, an almost magnetic pull that overpowered his fear. He grabbed the rusted handle and yanked the trapdoor open. A rush of cold air hit him, carrying with it a foul, metallic smell. Below was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Sam," Rachel said, her voice sharp. "We can't go down there." "We don't have a choice," Sam said, his voice hollow. He started down the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. Rachel followed, muttering curses under her breath. The air grew colder as they descended, the darkness pressing in around them. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, matching the rhythm of the thumping sound. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest. The thumping was coming from inside it. Sam approached the chest, his hands trembling. Rachel grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said, her voice desperate. "I have to," Sam said. He knelt before the chest, his fingers hovering over the latch. With a deep breath, he opened it. Inside was a single, beating heart, suspended in a pool of dark liquid. It pulsed rhythmically, each beat sending a shiver through the room. "What the hell is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Sam could answer, the heart began to change. It twisted and contorted, its surface bubbling as if it were alive. And then it spoke. "You can't run from me," it said, its voice echoing in the small room. Sam staggered back, his mind reeling. The heart pulsed faster, the room shaking with each beat. The creature's voice filled the air, cold and mocking. "You thought you could escape, Sam? You belong to me now." Rachel grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him toward the stairs. "We have to get out of here." They ran up the stairs, the sound of the heart's thumping growing louder, almost deafening. As they burst out of the cabin, the forest around them seemed to come alive, the shadows twisting and writhing. The creature was everywhere. Its laughter echoed through the trees surrounding them. Sam and Rachel ran blindly, the oppressive darkness swallowing them whole. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Sam and Rachel froze, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest was silent again, the cabin nowhere in sight. But they knew it wasn't over. It was never over. The world around them was still, unnervingly so. Sam and Rachel stood in the middle of the forest, their backs pressed to each other, eyes darting nervously. The chilling silence that had descended was unlike any quiet they had ever experienced. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something. The thumping, the laughter, the oppressive shadows, it was all gone, but the sense of dread lingered like an invisible cloud. Rachel wiped her forehead, her fingers shaking. Sam, what the hell just happened? He didn't have an answer. He couldn't even begin to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The heart, the chest, the voice. It didn't make sense, but one thing was certain. That thing wasn't just hunting him. It was hunting them both. "Where's the cabin?" Rachel asked, her voice low. Sam turned around slowly, scanning the woods behind them. There was no sign of it. No sign of anything familiar. They had come from that direction, but now there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of trees. "We didn't imagine it," Sam said, his voice tense. Rachel nodded, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. "I don't know what's going on, Sam, but I'm starting to think we're not going to get out of this." Sam didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what little he knew. The creature, the heart, it had spoken to them. But what? What did it want from them? Why was it targeting him? And then, in the silence of the forest, it happened again. A voice. Not from the heart, but a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. It was like a ripple in the air, a tremor of something terrible closing in. Rachel gasped, stepping closer to Sam. "It's here. It's back." Sam felt it too, a strange pressure building around him, suffocating him in its intensity. He turned, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it was everywhere. The trees, the ground, the very air itself, it was closing in on them. And then the growl grew louder. From the shadows of the trees, something emerged. At first, it was just a shape, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the moon. But as it came closer, Sam could make out the details. The elongated limbs, the twisted body, and the face that wasn't quite human. It was the creature. But it was different this time. It was stronger, more powerful. Its form was larger, its eyes glowing in eerie red. It wasn't just following them anymore, it was hunting them with purpose. Sam took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "We need to run," he whispered. Rachel didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed his arm, pulling him in the opposite direction, away from the creature. They ran. The forest blurred around them as they sprinted through the thick underbrush, the sound of their footsteps drowning out everything else. But the creature was faster, its growl now a deafening roar that echoed in the distance. Sam could feel it getting closer, feel the ground tremble beneath him with every step it took. Rachel stumbled, her foot catching on a root. Sam reached out to grab her, but before he could, the creature was upon them. It lunged. Sam barely managed to pull Rachel out of the way in time, the creature's claws grazing his arm as it passed. The pain was sharp, burning through him, but they kept running. It wasn't until they reached the edge of a cliff that they stopped, breathless and panicked. The creature was right behind them, its growl reverberating in the air. Sam turned to face Rachel, his eyes wide with fear. "There's nowhere to go." Rachel's eyes were wild, her body trembling from exhaustion and terror. "We can't die here, Sam. Not like this." Sam's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that could save them. The creature was too fast, too strong. They didn't have the stamina to outrun it much longer. But then it hit him. "The heart," Sam said suddenly, his voice shaky but urgent. "The heart, it's connected to it. That's what it feeds on." Rachel blinked, confusion overtaking her. "What are you talking about? The heart? What does that have to do with this?" "Everything," Sam said, his eyes widening. "It's not just some random monster. The heart, it's what gives it power. If we can destroy it, maybe we can stop this thing for good." Rachel looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. "How do you know that?" "I don't know. But it has to be connected somehow. I felt it in that cabin." "I know it." The creature was growing closer, its dark figure emerging from the trees. Sam could hear its heavy breathing, the unmistakable sound of something hunting its prey. Sam grabbed Rachel's arm. "We don't have a choice. We have to go back." Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "You're crazy. We can't go back. It'll kill us." But Sam's mind was made up. He had felt the connection, the bond between the creature and the heart. It was the only way. If they could destroy the heart, they might stand a chance. "Come on," Sam said, dragging Rachel with him toward the woods. They didn't have much time. The creature was close now. Sam could feel it, the weight of its presence, like a shadow pressing in on them from all sides. But he couldn't let fear control him anymore. He had to act. They ran back into the forest, the sound of the creature's growl still following them. The path they had taken earlier was lost now, but Sam could feel the pull. It was as though something, some force, was guiding him. And then they saw it. The cabin. It was standing there as though it had never moved, its dilapidated form just as it had been before. The trapdoor, the stairs, the dark heart that had once beaten for them. Sam didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, pulling Rachel behind him. They didn't have time to think, to question. They just had to act. He grabbed the trapdoor handle and yanked it open. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. The heart was still there, still beating in the center of the room, its pulse vibrating through the floor. Sam didn't wait. He rushed forward, grabbing the heart. Its surface was slick with the same dark liquid, but this time the pulse was weak, faltering. He squeezed it in his hands. The heart screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a psychic wail that tore through Sam's mind, trying to break him down from the inside out. He could feel the creature's presence, its rage as it tried to pull the heart from his grasp. But Sam didn't let go. With one final desperate squeeze, he crushed the heart in his hands. The room shook, and then, for the first time in days, there was silence. The growling stopped. The pressure in the air disappeared. Sam collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his hands trembling as they opened to reveal the shattered remnants of the heart. Rachel was beside him in an instant, her arms around him, pulling him close. "Is it over?" she whispered. Sam didn't answer. He didn't know. But for the first time since they had entered the forest, he didn't feel the creature's presence. It was gone, at least for now. The stillness in the cabin was overwhelming. Sam sat on the cold, rotting floor, his head spinning. The remnants of the creature's heart lay crushed in his palms, now just a pool of dark, sticky liquid. He could feel the weight of everything he had just done, the terror, the desperation, the hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But deep down he knew better. This wasn't the end. Rachel was sitting nearby, her face pale, eyes wide with the same disbelief that had been there ever since they first set foot in the forest. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the remnants of the heart, her breath shallow. Sam's chest still ached, his arms sore from the effort of crushing the heart. His mind couldn't make sense of what had just happened. How could he have done it? How could he have just ended it? But as much as he wanted to believe that this was the end, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That wasn't a creature that could just die. It was something ancient, something primal. Something that lived off fear, that hunted relentlessly. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady as if the ground beneath him wasn't quite solid. Rachel didn't move, but her gaze followed him, full of concern and exhaustion. "Sam, are you sure it's gone?" Her voice was quiet, fragile, like it might shatter at any moment. "I'm not sure of anything anymore," he replied, his voice hoarse. "But for now, it feels like it's gone." Rachel didn't say anything, but Sam could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither of them were. The events of the past few days, hell, the past few weeks, had been surreal. Even now, in the cold silence of the cabin, the feeling of being watched, hunted, lingered. "I think we should go," Sam said, more to himself than to her. The cabin had already begun to feel too small, too suffocating, like it might collapse in on them any second. "We can't stay here." Rachel looked up, her eyes narrowing with a mix of exhaustion and fear. "Where would we go? We're in the middle of nowhere, Sam. There's nothing out there." "I don't care," Sam replied, his voice rising with an edge of desperation. "We can't sit here waiting for it to come back. We need to leave. We need to find a way out." Rachel stared at him for a long moment, then stood up, brushing dirt from her pants. "All right," she said, her voice defeated. "Let's go. But if this thing comes back..." It won't, Sam interrupted, though he wasn't sure he believed it. It can't. But even as the words left his mouth, a sickening chill ran through him. The silence of the cabin was so deep, it was as though the whole world was holding its breath. They both turned and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting them like a slap in the face. Sam squinted against the moonlight, his eyes scanning the forest around them. Looked the same. The same dark, oppressive forest. But it felt different now. More alive. Like it was aware of them. Watching them. Do you hear that? Rachel whispered, her voice low, almost scared. Sam froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a sound. Not the growl of the creature, but something else. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, measured. And there was no mistaking it. They weren't alone. The hairs on Sam's neck stood up, and he grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her back toward the cabin. His heart was hammering in his chest, the blood pounding in his ears. We need to move now, Sam hissed, his voice sharp with panic. Run? Without waiting for Rachel to react, he turned and bolted back toward the trees. The footsteps behind them seemed to grow louder, closer. They were chasing them. But this time it wasn't just the creature. It was more. Something else. Something darker. More insidious. As they ran through the forest, Sam's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What the hell was following them? Had they made a mistake by thinking they could destroy the heart? Was it possible they hadn't killed it at all? Had they missed something? The ground beneath them seemed to shift, the trees closing in tighter as they ran. The world was distorting, spinning around them. Sam felt dizzy, disoriented, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. And then he saw it. A figure. In the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall, its form draped in a cloak of shadows. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a featureless mask like something from a nightmare. Sam couldn't even tell if it was alive or dead. It was just there, watching them. He could feel Rachel's breath beside him, sharp and quick as she tried to keep up, but he couldn't stop. Not now. They couldn't stop running. But the figure didn't move. He just stood there still watching. Sam's feet faltered. He stumbled, heart racing as the realization hit him. We're not alone, he gasped, his voice hoarse from fear. We're surrounded. Rachel's face turned pale as she looked around, her eyes wide with horror. And that's when Sam saw it, shadows moving at the edge of the trees. They weren't just being followed. They were being cornered. The figure in front of them wasn't the only one. There were more. All around them. Emerging from the darkness like predators stalking their prey. The footsteps behind them were growing louder. Closer. Sam could hear their breath. Low and deep, like something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. Rachel stopped. Sam, she whispered, her voice trembling. What do we do? The weight of the situation crashed down on Sam. They were trapped. There was no way out. No escape. We can't outrun them, Sam said, his voice barely audible. We fight. We fight back. Rachel's face was pale with fear, but there was a fire in her eyes now. They had nothing left to lose. Sam, she began slowly, I don't think they're here to kill us. Sam looked at her in confusion, but before he could speak, she pointed to the figure ahead of them. It was no longer standing still. The creature, or whatever it was, moved forward, its arms stretching out toward them. And in a voice that made Sam's skin crawl, it spoke. You should have never left. The words, you should have never left, echoed in Sam's ears like a thunderclap. His stomach dropped. His pulse raced. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that the thing in front of them could speak or the dreadful certainty that it knew everything about them. Rachel's hand shot out and grabbed Sam's arm tightly, her fingers digging into his skin. He could feel the panic radiating off her in waves. Her breathing had become shallow, rapid, like she was trying to hold on to some semblance of control, but even she knew it was slipping away. They were surrounded. The shadows that had been creeping at the edge of the trees now seemed to stretch and writhe, their shapes almost liquid, too fluid to be real. There were figures everywhere. At least 5 or 6, tall, hooded, their forms swaying with a rhythm that seemed unnatural. They had no faces, no eyes, no mouths, just black, empty space where their features should have been. The forest had grown even darker. The moonlight, once bright, now appeared to be swallowed by the oppressive weight of the darkness around them. It felt as though the very air was thickening, growing heavier with each passing second. Sam's chest tightened. He could hardly breathe. The figure in front of them, the one that had spoken, took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movement unnatural, as though it was dragging itself toward them. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, as though it was drawing power from them, feeding on the darkness that filled the air. Sam stepped backward instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. His feet felt as if they were glued to the ground, his mind paralyzed with fear. He turned toward Rachel, trying to find some way to calm her, to get them both out of this nightmare, but when he saw the terror in her eyes, he knew they were both trapped. "Sam," she whispered hoarsely, her voice shaking. "What is that? What the hell is going on?" He had no answer. He didn't even know what they were facing. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, each thud like the ticking of a countdown clock. Whatever these things were, they weren't human. But they weren't entirely the same as the creature they had encountered before either. The thing in front of them, its form seemed to blur, the edges shifting and distorting like it was a mirage in the night. And yet it remained grounded, solid. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an oppressive energy. It didn't just stand in front of them, it loomed, filling the space with an invisible pressure. Sam felt like he was drowning under the weight of it. Rachel clung to him, her breathing so rapid it was as though she was hyperventilating. Her lips trembled, but she didn't let go. She was strong, but in this moment, even she could feel how hopeless their situation had become. The figure took another step forward, its presence pushing the boundaries of reality. The wind around them picked up, gusting violently, though there was no change in the atmosphere. It was like a storm that existed only within the confines of the trees, focused solely on them. Then, as though it were pulling a thread, the figure's form began to stretch upwards, towering over them, its dark cloak shifting like an endless black void. Its arms seemed to elongate, fingers stretching far too long to be natural. It reached toward them, and Sam instinctively took another step back, pulling Rachel with him, but the movement felt futile. There was nowhere to run. "Did you think?" The voice was soft, yet it reverberated through the forest, a hiss that seemed to vibrate inside Sam's skull. "Did you think you could escape?" Sam's throat tightened. The creature wasn't asking for an answer. It was mocking them, toying with them. It didn't want to fight. It just wanted to scare them. It wanted them to feel hopeless, to feel as though every step they had taken had been a mistake. "I don't want to die," Rachel's voice cracked, and Sam could feel the weight of her fear pressing down on him. "Please? Sam, what do we do?" Before Sam could respond, something in the air shifted. A sound that was not quite a sound, a vibration deep and powerful, rippled through the ground beneath their feet. The shadows around them surged forward, moving with unnatural speed, and Sam could feel a coldness in the pit of his stomach. These things, these entities, weren't just a physical threat. They were something else. Something that existed on a level beyond anything they understood. Without warning, the figure that had spoken lunged at them. Its arms shot forward with a speed that defied logic, its long, spindly fingers reaching for Rachel. Sam didn't think, he reacted. He grabbed Rachel and threw himself backward, pulling her with him. They fell to the ground, just in time for the creature's claws to swipe through the space where they had been standing. The air seemed to crackle with a force that nearly knocked the wind out of them. "Run!" Sam shouted, though the words were barely more than a gasp. He knew they couldn't outrun it. Not like this. But there was no time to think, no time to question what was happening. They had to move. They scrambled to their feet, each step feeling like it took more energy than the last. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, pulling at their feet as though the very earth was fighting them. The air grew colder, and with it, the growling, the shrill laughter returned. It was the creature. Its presence felt even if it wasn't in sight. It was everywhere. "Over there," Rachel shouted, her voice hoarse, pointing to a thicket of trees a few yards away. It was their only hope. Get to cover, hide, and maybe, just maybe, they could survive long enough to find an escape. But just as they started to move, the shadows converged on them. From every angle they were surrounded. The figures, these dark, twisted things, shifted and lurched toward them, closing in like a noose tightening around their necks. "Stop!" The voice from the figure broke through the chaos, its tone cold, indifferent. "You cannot run from what you have already awakened." Sam stopped in his tracks, heart hammering in his chest. What did it mean? What had they awakened? This wasn't just some mindless monster or creature. It was something older, something powerful. The figure, now fully materialized before them, tilted its head. Its mask, if you could even call it that, seemed to warp and distort as if trying to form a face. But it was more than that. The way it moved, the way it spoke, it was almost as if it were a conduit for something else. Something beyond human comprehension. "You have broken the balance," it said, its voice growing louder, stronger. "And now, you will pay." The realization hit Sam like a slap. He had been right all along. They had been drawn into something far darker than they could have imagined. Something that was not just seeking vengeance, it was trying to reclaim control. They weren't in control of this nightmare anymore. They were part of it. "Sam," Rachel gasped, her voice barely audible. We need to do something." But what could they do? They had destroyed the heart. They had done everything they thought would end it. And yet, the nightmare was far from over. It wasn't just about the creature. It wasn't just about the forest. It was about them. And as the shadows closed in, Sam realized with a sinking dread that they had made a mistake. They hadn't escaped. They had only awakened the true horror. And now they were part of it. The shadows loomed around them, closing in tighter with each breath, with each heartbeat. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that felt too loud, too intense in the suffocating silence. Rachel was trembling beside him, her hand clutching his with a desperation he hadn't seen before. He could hear her ragged breathing, feel the terror that seemed to fill the air. But there was something else now too, a sense of finality. It was almost as if the forest itself had become one with the creatures that surrounded them. The trees felt alive, their gnarled branches reaching out like hands trying to pull them deeper into the darkness. The ground beneath their feet felt softer, almost sponge-like, as though the very earth was absorbing their fear, feeding off it. "Sam, we need to do something," Rachel whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Her eyes were wide with horror, but there was a flicker of something else in her gaze now. A glimmer of understanding. It was as if she finally realized something Sam had known for some time. The real danger wasn't the creature itself. It was the forest. The entire place was cursed, a prison for something far worse than they could comprehend. Sam's mind was racing. He had to think of something. They couldn't just stand here, waiting to be consumed by the shadows. But what choice did they have? The creature's voice echoed in his mind, cold and unrelenting. "You have broken the balance." What balance? What had they done? And then, like a lightning bolt through his brain, it hit him. The heart. It wasn't just the physical heart of the creature they had destroyed. It wasn't just about killing it. The heart was the key to everything, to the balance, the curse. They had severed its lifeblood, but they hadn't severed its connection to the forest. They hadn't realized that the creature was not merely an entity, it was a guardian, a warden of the forest's dark secret. The heart was its anchor, and by destroying it, they had done the one thing that could break the very fabric of the curse. They hadn't killed the creature. They had unleashed it. We need to fix this," Sam said, his voice shaking but resolute. He turned toward the mass of shifting shadows surrounding them, searching for the heart, the one thing that could undo everything they had done. Rachel's eyes widened as she understood. "How? Where?" Without answering, Sam turned and sprinted toward the thicket of trees, the place where they had first encountered the creature, the place where everything had started. His legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kept him moving. The shadows were following, creeping along the ground like liquid night, but he couldn't afford to stop. Rachel was right behind him, her footsteps faltering but determined. She couldn't see what he saw, but she trusted him. They reached the spot, and Sam dropped to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground was soft here, almost unnaturally so. As he dug into the earth, the sensation of something alive beneath the soil made his skin crawl. He kept digging, pulling away the dirt with frantic desperation. The air around them grew thick, and the ground rumbled beneath their feet, as though the forest was waking up. And then, his fingers brushed against something cold. Something smooth. The heart. It wasn't gone. It had been buried, hidden away beneath the forest floor, a part of the ancient system that kept the curse alive. Sam's fingers closed around it, and the forest seemed to recoil as though it had been wounded. "Sam?" Rachel shouted, her voice laced with fear. "Hurry!" He didn't need to hear her. He was already pulling the heart from the earth, cradling it in his hands like it was the only thing that could save them. But as he stood up, something else began to shift. The forest seemed to ripple with a low, thrumming energy. The shadows that had surrounded them were retreating, but not because they were afraid. They were watching, waiting. The figure, the creature, the warden appeared once more. It was no longer an amorphous shadow. It was fully formed, towering above them, its cloak swirling like smoke. Its face was still nothing but a void, but Sam could feel its gaze, cold, judgmental, ancient. "You cannot undo what you've done," the creature's voice boomed, now no longer a whisper but a terrifying roar. "You cannot take back what you've unleashed." Sam's hands tightened around the heart, his knuckles white with the strain. He didn't care what the creature said. He couldn't stop now. With every ounce of strength he had left, Sam thrust the heart into the earth, burying it deep into the soil where it had once been. The moment it made contact, the forest trembled violently. A sound like cracking stone filled the air. The ground beneath them shuddered, as if the earth itself was crying out in pain. But then something began to change. The shadows, once thick and oppressive, began to retreat, dissolving into the night like mist. The air grew still. The forest fell silent. The oppressive weight that had filled the air, the feeling of being hunted, began to lift. And then the warden was gone. The shadows disappeared. The moonlight flooded back into the clearing, spilling over the trees, casting everything in a soft, eerie glow. Sam and Rachel stood in the middle of the clearing, breathless, trembling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, their hearts still pounding in their chests, processing the impossible. It was over. The silence stretched out between them, but this time, it wasn't filled with dread. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that follows a storm. They had survived. But at what cost? What had they truly awakened? And then, as if on cue, Rachel spoke. "Sam, we did it, didn't we?" Sam looked at her, his eyes wide, his chest still tight with adrenaline. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know if they were truly free. But for the first time in days, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. Whatever had happened in that forest, whatever had been lurking in the dark, it was finally over. The curse had been broken. The warden's grip had loosened. But the forest wasn't done with them yet. Sam looked over at Rachel one last time. "We're not safe yet," he said softly, his voice steady but full of foreboding. "This was just the beginning. What we've awoken, it's not finished." As he spoke, the earth beneath them trembled once again. Not with fear, but with the unyielding force of something ancient, something waiting. And that, my friend, is the end of the story. The terror, the curse, the monsters, they may have been defeated, but in the darkest corners of the forest, something still stirs. Something that will never truly be gone. But sometimes, the darkness is only waiting for the right moment to come back. Story 2. Noah woke up drenched in sweat, the kind of sweat that doesn't come from heat but from the kind of fear that clings to your bones. His chest heaved as he sat upright in his bed, the faint glow of his phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. He glanced at the screen, 3:15 a.m. The same time as always. For the past week, something had been happening. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was enough to unnerve him. Doors creaked when there was no wind. Shadows moved just out of the corner of his eye. And worst of all, every night at 3:15 a.m., his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The messages weren't threats. They weren't pleas. They were worse, because they were nothing but a single word. Soon. Noah tried to shake it off the first night. Spam, he thought. Someone playing a prank. But by the fourth night, it wasn't just the messages. He began hearing whispers. At first, they were faint, almost like his imagination was trying to scare him. But then they grew louder, unmistakable. They were coming from his closet. Tonight was no different. The message had buzzed in, the words soon glaring up at him, and now the whispers were back. He stared at the closet door, heart pounding. He wanted to look away, but something in the air, something heavy and suffocating, held his gaze. Noah, his name, clear as day, spoken from inside the closet. His body froze. He told himself not to move, not to even breathe too loudly. But the voice came again, louder this time. Noah, opened the door. It wasn't a request. It was a command. No, he whispered under his breath, but the word barely made it past his lips. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling so badly it felt like he was trying to lift a weight. He dialed the first number that came to mind, his best friend, Mia. She answered on the third ring, groggy and annoyed. "What the hell, Noah? Do you know what time it is?" "I think there's someone in my closet," he hissed, barely audible. There was silence on the other end. Then Mia laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right? Does it sound like I'm kidding?" His voice cracked and he hated how scared he sounded. All right, I'll come over. Just stay on the phone, okay? Don't do anything stupid." Noah nodded even though she couldn't see him. He kept the phone pressed to his ear as he stared at the closet. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Minutes felt like hours, and then finally he heard the sound of Mia's car pulling into his driveway. Relief flooded through him as he rushed to unlock the front door. But when he opened it, Mia wasn't there. Instead, there was a single piece of paper lying on the welcome mat. His hands shook as he picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. "You shouldn't have called her." He stumbled back, dropping the note as if it had burned him. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. The same unknown number. The same single word. Now. Behind him, the closet door creaked open. Noah turned, the air in the room turning cold enough to make his breath visible. His vision blurred, whether from fear or tears, he wasn't sure. He wanted to run, scream, anything but stand there like a statue. But his feet were rooted to the floor as the darkness in the closet seemed to grow, spilling out into his room like black ink. A hand reached out from the shadows. Pale, skeletal, with long claw-like fingers. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring his terror. "Noah," the voice said again, closer this time, almost in his ear. Then everything went black. When Noah woke up, he wasn't in his room anymore. The walls were cold stone, and the air smelled of damp earth. He sat up, his head pounding, and realized he wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the darkness, whispering, laughing, watching. And then one of them stepped into the faint light. It was Mia, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of recognition or relief. It was something sinister. "You shouldn't have called me," she said, her voice a hollow echo. Noah backed away, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might explode. "Mia, what's going on? Where are we?" She tilted her head as if considering the question. "We're where they want us to be. And now they want you." Before he could respond, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the space with a cacophony of voices. He covered his ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just around him, they were in his head. "Noah, you can't escape." The darkness closed in again, swallowing him whole. Noah's eyes snapped open, and he gasped for air as if he had been suffocating. His body ached as though he had been dragged through miles of rough terrain. He sat up, his heart still racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. The stone walls were gone. The suffocating darkness was replaced by the dim light of dawn creeping through the curtains of his bedroom. It was as if everything had been a nightmare, but the weight in his chest told him it wasn't. He scanned the room. Everything looked normal, too normal. The closet door was shut, the air was still, and the whispers were gone. He grabbed his phone, half expecting another text, but the screen was blank. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over. Then he noticed the scratches on his arms. Thin, jagged lines crisscrossed his skin, as if something with sharp nails had clawed at him. They weren't there before. He could feel the sting now, sharp and undeniable. Noah's stomach churned. He stumbled into the bathroom, flipping on the light and staring at his reflection. The scratches weren't the only thing. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a faint mark on his neck, 3 small, round bruises like a handprint. "No," he whispered to himself. "No, no, no." He tried scrubbing at the bruises as if they would just vanish under the water. But they didn't. Panic rose in his throat as he backed away from the mirror, bumping into the counter. A sound broke the silence. It wasn't loud, just a faint tapping noise. It came from the hallway. Noah froze, his breath caught in his throat. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving closer to his bedroom door. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling so badly it almost slipped from his grip. He dialed Mia's number again. This time it went straight to voicemail. "Damn it," he hissed. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on his chest. He stepped out of the bathroom, inching toward the bedroom door. His hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the doorknob, hesitating. Then the whisper came again. "Noah?" His blood turned to ice. It was the same voice from the closet, but this time it was right outside his door. He flung the door open, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hallway was empty. No shadows. No whispers. Nothing. He stood there for a long moment, his breathing ragged, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When nothing did, he forced himself to move, creeping down the hallway toward the front door. He needed to get out, go somewhere, anywhere, but here. As he reached the living room, his phone buzzed. He jumped, nearly dropping it. The screen lit up with a new message. This time it wasn't a single word. It was a video. Noah hesitated, his thumb hovering over the play button. Every instinct screamed at him to delete it, throw the phone away, and never look back. But he couldn't. He needed to know. He tapped the screen. The video was dark and grainy, like it had been filmed on an old camcorder. At first, he couldn't make out anything but static and faint movement. Then the camera panned and his blood ran cold. It was his house. The view moved through the living room, the hallway, and finally stopped at his bedroom door. The door creaked open and the camera stepped inside. Noah's breath caught as he saw himself, lying in bed, thrashing in his sleep. The whispers started again, faint at first but growing louder. The camera moved closer to his sleeping form, the screen shaking slightly as if whoever, or whatever, was holding it was trembling with excitement. Then a hand reached out from behind the camera. The same pale, claw-like hand from the closet. It moved toward his face, brushing against his skin. Noah's sleeping form stilled and his eyes snapped open, staring directly at the camera. The video cut to black. Noah dropped the phone, his entire body trembling. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. A loud knock at the front door shattered his thoughts. He turned, his heart hammering in his chest. He moved toward the door slowly, his feet feeling like lead. When he opened it, there was no one there. Just another piece of paper on the mat. This one had a single sentence scrawled across it in the same jagged handwriting. "You can't run from us." Noah slammed the door, locking it and backing away. His mind raced, searching for answers. What did they want? Why him? The air around him grew cold again, and the whispers returned, louder this time. They were coming from every direction, filling the room, the walls, his head. Noah? He pressed his hands to his ears, screaming, "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then a single voice answered, clear and chilling. "We want you to remember." Before he could react, the world around him shifted again. The walls dissolved into darkness, the floor fell away, and he was falling, plunging into the void. When he landed, he was back in the stone room. But this time it wasn't empty. Figures stood all around him, their faces hidden in shadow. And at the center of the room was a single chair. It wasn't empty. It was Mia. She was tied to the chair, her head slumped forward. Noah ran to her, his voice cracking as he called her name. "Mia, wake up." Her head lifted slowly, her eyes glassy and lifeless. She smiled that same twisted smile, and Noah stumbled back, his stomach churning. "You shouldn't have called me," she said again. Then the figures in the shadows began to move, closing in around him. Noah's throat was dry, his chest heaving with each panicked breath as the figures closed in. The darkness seemed alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that pressed against him from all sides. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His legs felt like they were encased in cement, and his mind was racing too fast to make sense of what was happening. The figures weren't entirely solid. They flickered like candle flames in a draft, their edges blurring and dissolving into the shadows. Yet their eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with an intensity that made Noah's skin crawl. They weren't human. They weren't anything he could name. Mia, or the thing that looked like Mia, was still in the chair, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her smile widened, the skin of her cheek stretching to the point where it seemed it might tear. "They're waiting for you," she said, her voice a hollow echo that reverberated in the stone room. Noah stumbled back, his legs finally obeying him, but there was nowhere to go. The figures surrounded him, their whispers growing louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of menace. He couldn't make out the words, but he felt their intent, a deep, primal malice that sent shivers down his spine. "What do you want from me?" he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. One of the figures stepped forward, its form solidifying as it moved closer. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its head was featureless, a smooth expanse of shadow, but it leaned down as if it were studying him. "You don't remember?" it said, the words vibrating through the air. Noah shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost curious. Then it raised one of its long clawed fingers and pointed at Mia. "She does?" Noah turned to look at her, his stomach churning. "Mia, what's going on? Please tell me what's happening." Her expression shifted, the eerie smile fading. For a moment she looked like herself again, scared, vulnerable, human. "Noah," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You have to remember. If you don't, they'll take us both." "Remember what?" he cried, frustration and fear boiling over. Before she could answer, the shadows surged forward, engulfing her. Noah screamed her name, lunging toward the chair, but the darkness knocked him back like a physical force. When it receded, the chair was empty. Mia was gone. "No," he whispered, his knees hitting the cold stone floor. "No, no, no." The figure that had spoken moved closer, its presence towering over him. "You can't save her if you don't face the truth." Noah's head snapped up, anger flaring through his terror. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand and the room around them shifted again. The stone walls dissolved, replaced by a scene that made Noah's blood run cold. It was his childhood home. He was standing in the living room, the same room he had grown up in. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture worn, but it was unmistakably the place where he had spent his early years. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. It's not real." "It is," the figure said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "And you will see." Noah turned, his heart pounding as he heard voices, familiar voices. He followed the sound, his legs moving on their own, until he reached the doorway to the kitchen. There they were, his parents. They looked younger, happier, untouched by the years of strain and sadness that Noah remembered. His father was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper, while his mother was at the stove, humming a tune as she cooked. "No," Noah took a step back, his head spinning. "This isn't right. They're dead. They've been dead for years." The figure's voice was calm, almost mocking. "Memories don't die. They just hide." The scene shifted again, faster this time. The kitchen dissolved, replaced by a dark, narrow hallway. At the end of the hallway was a door. Noah knew that door. He had spent years pretending it didn't exist, forcing himself to forget what lay behind it. But now, it loomed before him, an inescapable reminder of the one thing he had buried so deep he thought it was gone forever. "You have to open it," the figure said, its voice cold and unyielding. "I can't," Noah whispered, his body trembling. "You must." The whispers returned, louder than ever, pushing him forward. His legs felt like they were moving through quicksand, but he couldn't stop. The door grew closer, its surface scarred and splintered, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. His hand reached for the doorknob, shaking so badly he could barely grip it. "Noah," the figure said, its voice sharp. "Face it." He turned the knob, the metal cold against his skin. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. And then he saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes staring at him from the void. "Noah." The voice was his own. The darkness surged forward, pulling him in. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his room. But it wasn't the same. The walls were covered in scratches, the floor littered with fragments of broken glass. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the whispers were louder than ever. His phone buzzed. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. The message was different this time. "It's your turn now." And then the closet door began to open. Noah's heart pounded as the closet door creaked open. The air grew colder, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decay. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes and pretend this wasn't happening, but he couldn't. Something was emerging from the darkness, and he was powerless to stop it. A low growl echoed from within, guttural and menacing, vibrating through the room. Noah staggered backward, his chest tightening with every breath. His mind raced for an explanation, a way out, anything, but there was nothing. Then it stepped into the light. At first, he couldn't fully comprehend what he was seeing. The figure was humanoid in shape, but impossibly distorted. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched taut over protruding bones. And its eyes, those glowing red eyes, bore into Noah with an intensity that froze him in place. "Noah," it said, its voice a twisted mockery of his own. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The creature tilted its head further, the motion accompanied by a sickening crack. "You already know," it said, stepping closer. "No, I don't," Noah yelled, retreating until his back hit the wall. The creature stopped, its face, or what passed for a face, contorting into something resembling a smile. "You've forgotten, but we haven't. It's time you remembered." Before Noah could respond, the room around him dissolved into darkness again. He was falling, tumbling through a void that seemed to stretch on forever. His screams were swallowed by the silence, and his body felt weightless, disconnected from reality. When he finally landed, he was in a different place. The air was thick and oppressive, and the faint glow of a single light bulb illuminated the room. It was small and cramped, with concrete walls and a single metal door. The smell of mildew and rust was overpowering. Noah pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling. He had been here before, he was certain of it, but the memory was hazy, just out of reach. The metal door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was Mia. But she wasn't the Mia he remembered. Her hair was matted, her skin pale and bruised. Her eyes, once warm and lively, were now hollow and lifeless. She looked at him, and for a moment he thought she was going to say something. But she didn't. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed at the corner of the room. Noah turned, his stomach knotting as he saw what she was pointing at. There, in the corner, was a small, blood-stained box. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I'm not opening that." "You have to," Mia said, her voice devoid of emotion. "No," he repeated, backing away. "I don't want to. I don't want to know." "You don't have a choice," she said, stepping closer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and unnatural, as if she were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Noah's back hit the wall again, and he realized there was no escape. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, filling the room with their maddening cacophony. They were chanting his name over and over, urging him toward the box. His feet moved on their own, carrying him forward. Every step felt like a betrayal, but he couldn't stop. The box seemed to grow larger as he approached, its presence consuming the room. When he reached it, his hands trembled violently. He didn't want to touch it, but something compelled him to. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the cold, sticky surface. The chanting grew louder. "Noah, open it." He closed his eyes, his breath hitching, and lifted the lid. The contents were worse than anything he could have imagined. Inside were fragments of bone, shards of glass, and scraps of fabric stained with dried blood. But what caught his attention was the photograph resting on top. It was a picture of him. In the photo, he was standing in the woods, a twisted smile on his face. His hands were covered in blood, and behind him were the bodies of his parents. "No," Noah whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not real. That didn't happen." "It did," Mia said from behind him. He turned to face her, tears streaming down his face. "Why are you doing this to me? What do you want?" "We don't want anything," she said, her voice eerily calm. "This is about what you did. What you tried to forget." "No," he screamed, clutching the photo. "I didn't do this. I couldn't have." The room began to shift again, the walls melting away. Noah was back in the woods, the same woods from the photograph. The ground was damp beneath his feet, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine and decay. He looked down and saw his hands. They were covered in blood. "No," he whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it was. The shadows began to move around him, taking shape. They were his parents, their faces twisted in agony. "Why, Noah?" His mother's voice echoed through the trees. "We trusted you," his father's voice followed. Noah fell to his knees, clutching his head as the memories came flooding back. He saw flashes of the past, his parents yelling, the knife in his hand, the look of betrayal on their faces as he... "No," he screamed, tears streaming down his face. The shadows closed in, their whispers a relentless tide of accusation and anger. Noah's screams were swallowed by the darkness as the truth consumed him. He was the monster. The darkness surrounding Noah was suffocating, a heavy void pressing in from every side. His body felt weightless, yet he was rooted in place, unable to move. The whispers had become a roar, a cacophony of voices screaming his name, accusing him, condemning him. He tried to block them out, pressing his hands to his ears, but it was useless. They weren't coming from outside, they were inside his head. Noah? The voice was soft, almost tender, cutting through the chaos like a blade. He opened his eyes and the darkness parted. He was in a different place now. The room was small and dimly lit, the faint glow of a single bulb casting long shadows on the walls. The air was cold, heavy with the metallic tang of blood. There was a table in the center of the room, and on it lay a figure covered by a white sheet. Noah's stomach turned as he took a step closer. The whispers had faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic pounding, his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The sheet shifted as if whatever was beneath it had moved. "No," he whispered, backing away. "I don't want to do this." "You have to," said a voice behind him. He spun around to find Mia standing there, her expression blank, her eyes empty. She looked like a shadow of herself, her skin pale and translucent, her movements slow and mechanical. "Noah," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "You can't run from this anymore." "I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted, the panic rising in his chest. She tilted her head, a gesture so eerily familiar it sent a chill down his spine. "Yes, you do." The pounding in his head grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. He turned back to the table, his hands shaking. The sheet moved again, a low moan escaping from beneath it. Noah clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "I can't. I won't." "You don't have a choice," Mia said, stepping closer. Her voice was cold, devoid of empathy. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the edge of the sheet. The room seemed to hold its breath as he pulled it back. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was himself. The body on the table was unmistakably him, but it wasn't alive. Its skin was gray and mottled, its eyes sunken and lifeless. The chest was marred by deep gashes, the wounds jagged and raw. "No," Noah whispered, stumbling back. "This isn't real. It can't be real." "It is," Mia said, her voice now behind him. He turned, but she was gone. Instead, the room was filled with shadows, figures emerging from the darkness. They were faceless, their forms shifting and flickering like static on a screen. One of them stepped forward, its presence suffocating. "You remember now," it said, its voice deep and resonant. Noah shook his head, his mind racing. "No, I don't understand." The figure reached out, its long, clawed hand pointing at the body on the table. "This is what you are. What you've always been." "No," Noah said, his voice trembling. I'm not like that." "You are," the figure said, stepping closer. "And you've always known." The walls of the room began to shift, the concrete cracking and crumbling away. Noah found himself standing in the woods again, the ground slick with mud and the air thick with the scent of rain. He looked down and saw the knife in his hand. It was covered in blood. The memories came flooding back, vivid and relentless. He saw himself standing over the bodies of his parents, his hands shaking as the knife fell from his grip. He heard their voices, their screams, the sound of their bodies hitting the ground. "No," he screamed, dropping the knife. But the scene didn't change. The shadows surrounded him, their whispers turning into laughter, cold, mocking, and cruel. "You did this," the figure said, towering over him. "You tried to bury it, to forget. But you can't escape what you are." "No," Noah said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to." "It doesn't matter," the figure said, its face inches from his. "The truth doesn't care about your excuses." Noah fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the ground as the weight of his guilt crushed him. He had spent years running, hiding from the truth, but now it was laid bare before him. "You belong to us now," the figure said, its voice a sinister whisper. The ground beneath Noah began to shift, the mud swallowing him whole. He struggled, clawing at the earth, but it was no use. The shadows closed in, their laughter echoing in his ears as he sank deeper into the darkness. Just before the void consumed him, he heard Mia's voice. "Noah, it's not over yet." Noah awoke with a jolt, gasping for air as if he'd been drowning. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It wasn't comforting, it was oppressive. He was lying on cold, wet ground, the smell of damp earth filling his nostrils. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his limbs trembling under the weight of exhaustion and dread. The world around him was unfamiliar. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating a dense fog that clung to the forest floor. There were no sounds, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, not even the wind. He wasn't alone. Noah turned, his heart racing as he saw the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was still, its posture unnervingly rigid. "Mia?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Noah's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. Instead, he took a hesitant step forward. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure moved then, not forward but sideways, circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. Its movements were unnatural, disjointed, as though its body didn't quite fit together. "Noah?" The voice sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't coming from the figure, it was inside his head. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty forest. The figure stopped, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "To remember," the voice said. "I don't understand," Noah yelled, frustration and fear bubbling over. The figure stepped closer, the fog parting to reveal its face, or lack thereof. Its features were a blank slate, smooth and featureless, yet somehow it exuded malice. Noah stumbled back, his foot catching on a root. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of him. The figure loomed over him now, its presence suffocating. "You've buried the truth," it said, its voice low and guttural. "But the past doesn't stay buried." The ground beneath Noah began to shift, the dirt rippling like water. Hands, thin, pale and clawed, emerged from the soil, grasping at him. He screamed, thrashing as the hands pulled him down. The forest dissolved into darkness once more. When Noah opened his eyes again, he was in a house. Not just any house, their house. The walls were lined with family photos, the furniture arranged exactly as he remembered it. But something was wrong. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the light fixtures flickered erratically. "Noah?" The voice was faint, coming from upstairs. He didn't want to go. Every instinct told him to run, to get out of the house, but his feet moved anyway. Step by step, he climbed the staircase, each creak of the wood like a gunshot in the silence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long. The doors on either side were closed, but one at the end stood ajar, a faint light spilling out. "Noah?" The voice called again, louder this time. He walked toward the open door, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside was his childhood bedroom. The walls were covered in drawings, crude, childlike depictions of a family. But as Noah looked closer, he noticed something horrifying. In every drawing, the figures were scratched out, their faces replaced with red smears. On the bed sat a small box. Noah's breath caught in his throat. It was the same box he had seen earlier, the one Mia had pointed to. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. But the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Open it," they chanted. His hands moved on their own, reaching for the box. When he opened it, the room was flooded with light, blinding him. The light faded, and Noah found himself in a new place. It was a hospital room, sterile and cold. The walls were a sickly shade of green, and the air smelled of antiseptic. In the bed lay a figure hooked up to various machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Noah approached the bed, his legs trembling. The figure in the bed was him. His face was pale, his body thin and frail. He looked as though he hadn't moved in years. What is this?" Noah whispered, his voice shaking. "This is where you've been," said a voice behind him. He turned to see Mia standing there, her expression soft but sad. "No," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't real. It can't be." "You've been here all along, Noah," Mia said. "Trapped in your own mind. Reliving the same nightmare over and over." He stumbled back, his head spinning. Why would I do this to myself?" "To escape," she said simply. The memories came flooding back. The fight with his parents. The rage. The knife. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to." "You couldn't live with what you'd done," Mia said, stepping closer. "So you created this, a prison for your mind. A place where you could hide from the truth." The heart monitor began to beat faster, the sound growing louder and more frantic. "Noah," Mia said, her voice urgent. "You have to make a choice. Stay here and keep running, or face what you've done." The room began to dissolve, the walls crumbling away. The hospital bed vanished, and Noah was falling again, tumbling through the void. As he fell, he heard Mia's voice one last time. Choose Noah? Noah's fall was endless, a dizzying plunge through a void so dark it seemed to swallow him whole. His breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick and suffocating. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The darkness wasn't empty, it was alive, pulsing with whispers, laughter, and faint cries. And then, suddenly, he stopped. He wasn't sure if he hit the ground or simply ceased falling, but the sensation was jarring. He stood in what appeared to be a vast expanse of black water, the surface perfectly still, reflecting nothing. Noah? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was familiar, but distorted, layered with something unnatural. Noah, it's time. The black water rippled, and a figure rose from its depths. It was a perfect mirror of Noah himself, down to the last detail, but its eyes were empty, hollow pits that seemed to devour light. No, Noah whispered, stepping back. The reflection tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. Why do you run? You know the truth. I don't know anything, Noah yelled, his voice echoing into the void. Yes, you do, the reflection said, its tone calm but menacing. You've always known. You just didn't want to see it. The water began to ripple again, and more figures emerged, their forms shifting and flickering. They surrounded him, faceless and silent, their presence oppressive. What do you want from me? Noah demanded, his voice trembling. To remember, the reflection said. All of it. The figures stepped closer, their faceless heads turning toward him as if they could see him. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, until they were a deafening roar. Images began to flash before Noah's eyes, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. He saw himself as a child, sitting at the dinner table, his parents arguing in the background. Their voices were sharp, filled with anger and bitterness. He saw the knife in his hand, its blade gleaming under the harsh kitchen light. He saw their faces, frozen in expressions of shock and pain. No, Noah screamed, falling to his knees. Stop it. But the images kept coming, relentless and unmerciful. He saw himself dragging their lifeless bodies into the woods, burying them beneath the roots of an ancient tree. He saw the years that followed, the guilt eating away at him, the nightmares that plagued his every moment of sleep. You tried to forget, the reflection said, its voice calm but cold. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you want it to. Noah covered his ears, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt them. Intentions don't matter, the reflection said, stepping closer. You did it. You can't escape that. The other figures began to close in, their faceless heads tilting as they reached for him. Their touch was ice cold, burning his skin like frostbite. No, Noah screamed, thrashing against them. Get away from me. The reflection knelt in front of him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. There's only one way out of this. The figures dissolved into mist, and Noah found himself back in the woods. The ancient tree loomed before him, its gnarled roots twisted and blackened. The ground beneath it was freshly dug, the soil loose and dark. In the moonlight, he saw the knife again, its blade slick with blood. You buried them here, the reflection said, standing beside him now. This is where it all began. Noah shook his head, backing away. No, I won't do this. I can't. You have to, the reflection said. You can't move forward until you face what you've done. The ground began to shift, the dirt stirring as if something beneath it was trying to escape. Noah? The voice was faint, muffled, but unmistakably his mother's. No, Noah whispered, his chest tightening. You're not real. You're not real. The soil erupted, and two skeletal hands emerged, clawing at the air. Slowly, a figure pulled itself free, its face gaunt and decayed but still recognizable. It was her. You left us, she said, her voice hollow and broken. You left us here to rot. Noah fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean to. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. You had a choice, she said, her hollow eyes piercing into him. And you chose yourself. The reflection stepped forward, placing a hand on Noah's shoulder. It's time to make another choice. The knife appeared in Noah's hand, its weight familiar and terrible. You can end this, the reflection said. But you have to decide. Noah looked at the knife, his hand trembling. He could feel the weight of their stares, his mother's, his father's, the faceless figures in the shadows. Do you want to stay here? The reflection asked. Trapped in this nightmare forever? Or will you face the truth and accept what you've done? The ancient tree groaned, its branches creaking as if it, too, awaited his decision. Noah closed his eyes, his mind racing. He didn't want to face the truth, but he couldn't keep running. The weight of his guilt was unbearable, crushing him from the inside out. Slowly he raised the knife. The whispers grew louder, a deafening chorus that seemed to echo from every corner of the forest. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. Noah, his mother said, her voice soft now. It's time to let go. With a deep breath, Noah plunged the knife into the ground. The forest erupted in light, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. The tree split down the middle, its roots curling back into the earth. The figures vanished and the whispers faded into silence. Noah fell to the ground, exhausted but somehow lighter. The air was still, the oppressive weight gone. As he looked up, he saw the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. For the first time in years, Noah felt free. If you've made it this far, you're just as brave as Noah. Stories like these remind us of the power of facing what haunts us, no matter how terrifying it might be. And if you found yourself holding your breath along the way, make sure you hit subscribe, because there's so much more waiting in the shadows. Story 3. It started with a sound. Not a scream, not a whisper, just a sound. Faint, distant, like the creak of old wood swaying in the wind. Nor froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway was dark, unnaturally dark, as though the shadows themselves had thickened. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 3:07 a.m. Her heart skipped a beat. People always said strange things happened at that hour, but she never believed it. Not until now. The sound came again, louder this time. A scraping noise, like nails dragged slowly across a chalkboard. It was coming from the basement. Nor had lived in this house her entire life and knew every creak, every groan of the old structure. But this sound was unfamiliar, deliberate, and it made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She tightened her grip on the mug of tea in her hand, its warmth a small comfort against the icy dread creeping into her chest. Just the house settling, she muttered under her breath, though her voice wavered. Placing the mug on the table, she turned toward the basement door, her steps hesitant. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill down the staircase. That light should have been reassuring, but it only made her unease grow. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone. No signal. Of course. The scraping stopped. For a moment, the silence was so profound it seemed like the entire world had gone still. Noor's shoulders relaxed slightly. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe. Her thoughts shattered as the sound returned, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A voice. Low, guttural, and barely audible. Noor. Her name. Someone or something was calling her name. Her body stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, scanning the darkened living room for any sign of movement. Shadows loomed everywhere, distorted and menacing in the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it would drown out any other sound. Noor, come down. The voice was clearer now, more insistent, and it was coming from the basement. Her legs trembled as she backed away from the door. She wanted to scream, to wake her parents, but fear had stolen her voice. Instead, she whispered to herself as if saying the words out loud would make them true. This isn't real. It's just a bad dream. But deep down, she knew she was wide awake. The basement door creaked open wider, the hinges groaning as if in protest. Noor's eyes widened, her body frozen in place. A cold draft wafted up from the dark stairwell, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. What? No, it couldn't be. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought, but the scent lingered. Noor, the voice was closer now, almost at the top of the stairs. She felt a chill run down her spine as she stared into the inky blackness below. She knew she should run, wake her parents, call for help, anything but stand there. Yet her feet refused to move, as though some unseen force was holding her in place. And then she saw it. A shadow emerged from the darkness, not walking but gliding up the stairs. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. As it reached the top step, the faint light from the living room illuminated its form, or rather, the absence of it. Its body was shrouded in darkness so deep it seemed to absorb the light around it. But what froze Noor in place was its face, or lack of one. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body was paralyzed with fear. The figure took a step toward her, its movements slow but deliberate. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She fell hard, the impact jarring her back to her senses. She scrambled to her feet, her hands slipping on the polished wooden floor. Without looking back, she bolted up the stairs to the second floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't dare turn around, didn't dare acknowledge the chilling sensation crawling up her spine. She reached her parents' bedroom door and threw it open. The bed was neatly made, untouched. The room was empty. "No, no, no," she muttered, her voice rising in panic. They had been here. She had seen them before she went to bed. Where could they have gone? Her chest tightened as she glanced around the room, her eyes darting to every corner. The voice came again, louder, more menacing. "Nor, you can't hide." Her blood ran cold. She spun around and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. She pressed her back against the door, her breaths shallow and rapid. For a moment, there was silence, and she allowed herself to hope that whatever was out there wouldn't follow her. Then came the knock. It wasn't on the door she had locked, but on the window. Her heart sank. The window was on the second floor. There was no way anyone or anything could be out there. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head toward the sound. Her breath hitched. A face was pressed against the glass, but it wasn't human. Its skin was pale and translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. Its eyes were black voids staring directly at her, and its mouth, too wide, too full of jagged teeth, stretched into a grotesque grin. "Nor," it whispered, its voice muffled by the glass. "Let me in." Her scream caught in her throat as the figure began to claw at the window, its nails leaving deep gouges in the glass. The sound was unbearable, a high-pitched screech that made her ears ring. She backed away, her mind racing. What was it? What did it want? And why her? The window cracked. Thin lines spiderwebbed across the glass as the creature's clawing grew more frantic. Nora's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She had to move. She had to get out of there. But where could she go? Every exit seemed blocked, every escape route cut off. The window shattered. Glass rained down onto the floor as the creature began to crawl inside, its movements jerky and unnatural. Nor didn't wait to see more. She turned and bolted for the hallway, her bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. The sound of its guttural growls followed her, growing louder with every passing second. As she reached the staircase, she risked a glance over her shoulder. The creature was right behind her, its elongated limbs stretching out toward her. She let out a choked sob and raced down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. Her only thought was to get out of the house, to put as much distance between herself and that thing as possible. But as she reached the front door, she froze. Standing in the doorway was another figure, identical to the first. Faceless, inhuman, and impossibly tall. It tilted its head as though studying her before taking a step forward. "Nor," it said, its voice a sinister echo of the first. "There's no escape." Nor stumbled backward, her breath catching as the second figure blocked the only visible way out. Its voice reverberated in her ears, low and guttural, the kind of sound that seemed to sink into her bones and cling to her soul. She could feel her body trembling, every nerve screaming at her to move, but the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing rooted her to the spot. Behind her, the first creature crawled closer, its sharp, claw-like fingers scraping the floor with an ear-piercing screech. She was trapped, caught between two horrors she couldn't comprehend. Tears blurred her vision as she tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her. This couldn't be real. Just couldn't. But the sound of the second creature's footsteps approaching shattered any illusion of safety. It moved with a deliberate slowness, as though savoring her fear. Nor's mind raced. If she stayed frozen, she would die, or worse. Summoning what little strength she had left, she turned and ran, heading for the only place that felt even remotely safe, her parents' room. Her feet barely touched the stairs as she sprinted back to the second floor. The air felt colder now, heavy with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her lungs. The shadows in the hallway flickered and twisted as if alive, and every step she took felt like she was being watched. She reached the bedroom door and slammed it shut behind her, locking it again. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room for something, anything, that could protect her. The sound of the creatures below grew louder. She could hear their claws scratching against the walls, their guttural breaths echoing through the house. And then, suddenly, silence. The quiet was worse. It was suffocating, oppressive, and filled with an unbearable tension. Nor strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement. Her heart felt like it was about to burst from the sheer pressure of waiting. A soft creak. It came from the ceiling. Her eyes shot upward and her blood ran cold. The plaster above her head cracked, a fine dust falling to the floor as something moved above her. The attic. How could they be in the attic? The question barely had time to form in her mind before another loud crack split the air, and a long skeletal hand punched through the ceiling. Nor screamed, scrambling away from the door as the creature began to tear at the plaster, widening the hole. Nor, the voice crooned, dripping with malice. There's nowhere to hide. She bolted for the window, her mind a chaotic blur of terror and desperation. Throwing the curtains aside, she fumbled with the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Her fingers were shaking too much to grip it properly. Behind her, the hole in the ceiling grew larger, chunks of plaster raining down as the creature's twisted body began to squeeze through. No, 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 she cried, tears streaming down her face. She slammed her fists against the window, hoping to break it, but it wouldn't crack. The glass remained stubbornly intact, as though the house itself was conspiring to trap her. The creature dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, its elongated limbs folding unnaturally as it straightened up. Nor turned to face it, her back pressed against the window. It stood there, motionless for a moment, as if relishing her fear. Then it tilted its head to the side, the motion sharp and unnatural. "Why run, Nor?" it hissed, its voice layered with something ancient and malevolent. "You can't leave. This is your home." Her home. The word struck her like a physical blow. This was her home, the place where she had grown up, where she was supposed to feel safe. And now it was a prison. A living nightmare. The creature took a step forward and she flinched, her body trembling uncontrollably. But then something unexpected happened. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Nor's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. Was it her father? Her mother? Someone who could help her? She dared to call out. "Mom? Dad? Is that you?" Her voice cracked, filled with desperation. The footsteps paused just outside the door. For a moment there was silence, and then the knob began to turn, slowly, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted to prolong the anticipation. The door creaked open, and Nor's heart sank as a figure stepped into the room. It was her father. But something was wrong. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were sunken, the whites tinged with an unnatural gray. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as he stepped further into the room. Behind him, her mother appeared, her expression blank and devoid of any warmth. Nor's stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't right. This wasn't them. "Mom? Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. What's wrong?" They didn't answer. Instead, they stood there, staring at her with vacant eyes. Her father's lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was the same guttural, menacing voice she had heard before. "You can't leave, Nor. You belong here." Her legs buckled and she fell to the floor, her mind reeling. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. She crawled backward, her hands scraping against the wooden floor as her parents advanced toward her. The creature from the attic watched silently, its head tilted as if amused by her despair. Her back hit the wall and she realized there was nowhere left to go. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thick and suffocating. Her parents loomed over her, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of what they once were. She closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. And then she heard it, a loud, deafening crash from downstairs. The sound was so sudden, so jarring, that it made the entire house tremble. Nor's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, everything was still. Even the creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the door as though listening for something. The crash came again, followed by a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't like the guttural whispers she had heard before. The sound was different. It was raw, primal, and filled with fury. Whatever it was coming closer. Her parents backed away, their movements jerky and unnatural, while the creature from the attic hissed, its elongated body recoiling. Nor's breath hitched as the door to the room slammed shut on its own, trapping her inside. The growling grew louder, shaking the very walls of the house. Nor pressed her hands over her ears, her body trembling as the noise reached a fever pitch. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Nor slowly lowered her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was eerily still, the air thick with tension. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something else had entered the house. And it wasn't here to save her. The silence was suffocating. Nor sat motionless against the wall, her pulse pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out any other sound. The door remained shut, and though the air was still, she could feel an oppressive energy pressing down on her, suffusing the room with something ancient and malevolent. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Her parents? No, those things pretending to be her parents had retreated. The creature from the attic had vanished, melting back into the shadows. And now something else had arrived. Something that seemed to terrify even the monsters. The growl had been unlike anything she'd ever heard, deep, guttural, and primal, as though it had come from the depths of the earth itself. What kind of force could scare the unthinkable horrors she just faced? And was it worse? She barely had time to think. A faint noise broke the quiet, a rhythmic tapping, soft at first but growing louder. It came from the other side of the door. Nor's breath hitched as she stared at the handle, waiting for it to turn. The tapping stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging across wood. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't sit there, couldn't let whatever was on the other side corner her. Nor, the whisper was back, low and stretched out, but it was different now, distorted, layered with voices that didn't belong together. It wasn't just one thing calling to her. It was many. The door creaked open. Her body tensed, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt glued to the floor. The darkness beyond the door was impenetrable, as though the hallway itself had swallowed the light. And then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the threshold, its form barely discernible in the blackness. It wasn't the creature from before. This one was different, larger. Its shape seemed to shift and flicker, as though it were caught between worlds. Nor's chest tightened as it stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under its weight. The light from the window cast just enough of a glow to reveal its silhouette, a hulking mass of twisted limbs and sharp angles, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing didn't come closer. Instead, it stopped just inside the doorway, its head tilting as though studying her. The air in the room grew colder, and Nor's breath came out in shaky puffs of mist. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Her body trembled under the weight of its gaze, even though it had no eyes, just an endless void where its face should have been. And then, without warning, it lunged. Nor screamed and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's outstretched claws. The wall splintered where she had been sitting, shards of wood flying through the air. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest, and bolted for the door. The creature roared, a deafening sound that made the entire house tremble. It moved with terrifying speed, its massive frame closing the distance between them in seconds. She darted into the hallway, her bare feet slipping on the polished floor as she ran. The house felt wrong, unfamiliar. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that reached out toward her. Doors that had always been there were gone, replaced by endless corridors that spiraled into darkness. It was as though the house itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap her. Nor, the voice was back, echoing all around her. It wasn't coming from the creature, it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air seemed to hum with it. She turned a corner and froze. The hallway in front of her was lined with mirrors. Tall, antique frames that she had never seen before, their surfaces polished to a gleaming perfection. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale, but something was wrong. In each mirror, her reflection moved slightly out of sync, delayed by a fraction of a second. And then, one by one, the reflections began to change. Her face twisted, her features contorting into grotesque shapes. In one mirror, her mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. In another, her eyes turned black, voids of endless darkness. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding as the reflections began to move on their own, banging against the glass as though trying to break free. Nor, the voice was louder now, almost a chant. She spun around, desperate to find a way out, but the hallway behind her was gone. In its place was a solid wall, its surface rippling like water. She pressed her hands against it, hoping it was some kind of trick, but it was solid. She was trapped. A loud crash shattered the air as the mirrors began to break, one by one. Glass rained down onto the floor, and from the shards, shadows began to rise. They twisted and coalesced, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. They had no faces, no features, just dark, shifting forms that oozed malice. They moved toward her, their footsteps silent but deliberate. Nor, the chant grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She backed away, her eyes darting around the corridor for an escape. The shadows closed in, their forms flickering and shifting with every step. Her mind screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then she felt it, a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, ready to fight, but there was no one there, just empty air. Her chest heaved as she looked around wildly, her fear threatening to overwhelm her. The shadows were closer now, their outstretched hands reaching for her. "No," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Stay away." The shadows stopped. For a moment, the corridor was still, the air heavy with tension. And then, as if responding to some unseen signal, they began to retreat. Nora's heart raced as she watched them melt back into the darkness, their forms dissolving like smoke. The voice came again, but this time it was different. Softer. Familiar. "Nor." She turned, her eyes widening. Standing at the far end of the corridor was a figure she recognized. Her younger brother, Sammy. He looked just as he had before he died, his wide, innocent eyes filled with fear. "Sammy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Is it really you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he held out his hand, beckoning her to follow. She hesitated, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Sammy had been gone for years. But the look in his eyes, the way he called her name, it was so real. "Nor, you have to come with me," he said, his voice urgent. "They're coming back. You're not safe here." Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She ran toward him, her heart aching with a strange mix of fear and hope. As she reached out to take his hand, the world around her began to shift. The walls rippled and faded, the darkness swallowing the corridor whole. And then everything went black. Nor opened her eyes to darkness. For a moment she thought she had gone blind. But as her breathing steadied, faint shapes began to emerge. A pale glow from an unknown source casting weak shadows across a cold, stone floor. She wasn't in the house anymore. The air here was damp and heavy, carrying a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. "Sammy?" she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. There was no answer. He had been there, hadn't he? She could still feel the warmth of his small hand in hers. But now she was alone again, the memory of his presence already fading like a cruel dream. A soft sound broke the silence, a faint drip of water, steady and rhythmic. Nor turned, her heart hammering, and realized she was in some sort of underground tunnel. The walls were rough and uneven, carved out of dark stone, and the floor sloped downward, leading into an endless black void. She took a cautious step forward, her bare feet cold against the damp surface. "Nor," the voice came again, quieter now, almost a whisper. It wasn't Sammy this time. It was something else, something familiar and wrong. She turned sharply, expecting to see another shadow, another monstrous form. But the tunnel behind her was empty. The voice came again, closer. "You shouldn't have followed." Her breath hitched and she spun back around. A figure stood at the edge of the faint light, a tall, thin man with a face half hidden in shadow. He wore old, tattered clothes and his eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. "Who are you?" she demanded, taking a step back. "What do you want?" The man didn't move. His expression was unreadable, but something about him radiated an unsettling calm. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, but it carried an unnatural weight. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This place isn't for the living." Her skin prickled. "I didn't choose to come here. I don't even know where here is." The man tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "You were brought here," he said, "because you ignored the warnings. You opened the door." "What door?" Nor snapped, frustration and fear bubbling over. "I didn't." She stopped, her mind flashing back to the box. The old, worn box her father had brought home. The strange symbols etched into its surface. The way the air had felt heavy when she opened it. The man nodded as if reading her thoughts. It wasn't meant for you, he said. It was sealed for a reason. Nor felt her throat tighten. I didn't know, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know what it was. It doesn't matter, the man said. You let it out. And now it's awake. A cold wave of dread washed over her. What's awake? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking down the tunnel, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence. Nor hesitated, every instinct telling her not to follow. But what choice did she have? Staying here alone was unthinkable. She hurried after him, her feet splashing through shallow puddles. The tunnel grew darker with each step, the faint light fading into a suffocating blackness. The only sound was the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the distant drip of water. Finally the man stopped. Nor nearly collided with him, her heart pounding as she tried to peer over his shoulder. In the dim glow of his ember-like eyes, she saw the tunnel open into a vast cavern. The air here was thick, almost sticky, and the metallic smell was stronger, mixed with something sour and putrid. In the center of the cavern was a pit. It was massive, stretching wider than she could see, and it seemed to pulse as if alive. A faint, reddish light emanated from its depths, casting eerie shadows on the cavern walls. Nor's stomach churned at the sight of it. The edges of the pit were jagged and uneven, as though the ground had been violently torn apart. What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the pit. "The source," he said, "of everything. The whispers, the shadows, the things you saw in your house. They come from here." She took a shaky step closer, her eyes locked on the pit. The light within it seemed to move, shifting and swirling like smoke. And then she saw them, figures writhing in the depths. Human shapes, but twisted and incomplete. Faces with empty eyes and mouths frozen in silent screams. "No," she breathed, backing away. "This can't be real." "It's real," the man said. "And it's growing stronger. Because of you." Her head snapped toward him, anger flaring despite her fear. "What do you mean, because of me? I didn't ask for this." "I didn't?" "It doesn't matter what you intended," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You opened the box. You broke the seal. And now it's feeding?" "Feeding on what?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The man turned to her, his glowing eyes piercing. "On fear. On pain. On you." Her knees buckled and she stumbled back, her hands trembling. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me? Why my family?" "It's not just you," the man said. "The seal was meant to protect everyone. But now it's broken and it won't stop until it's satisfied." "Then how do I stop it?" she demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "There has to be a way." The man's expression darkened. "There is," he said. "But it comes at a price." Before she could ask what he meant, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. The pit's red light flared, illuminating the walls in a fiery glow. Nor's breath caught as she saw them, shadows crawling out of the pit, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke given shape. They moved with terrifying speed, their eyeless faces turning toward her. "You brought them here," the man said, his voice grim. "Now you have to face them." Nor's heart felt like it was about to explode. The shadows were pouring out of the pit, faster now, spilling onto the cavern floor like a living tide. Their formless shapes twisted unnaturally, stretching and collapsing as they slithered toward her. The air grew colder with each passing second, carrying an unnatural stillness that pressed against her chest like an invisible weight. "You need to run," the man said, his glowing eyes fixed on the advancing swarm. "Now. But where?" Nor shouted, her voice cracking. The cavern was massive, with no visible exits beyond the tunnel they had come through, and that was quickly disappearing under the advancing tide of shadows. "Anywhere but here," the man snapped. He stepped forward, his hand raised toward the pit. For the first time, Nor saw the faint glow emanating from his fingers, runes etched into his skin, glowing with an otherworldly light. The shadows hesitated, their movements faltering as though the light hurt them. Nor didn't wait for him to repeat himself. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the slick stone as she stumbled toward the far end of the cavern. The ground was uneven, jagged rocks jutting up like teeth, and she nearly fell more than once. Behind her, the shadows hissed, their movements growing more erratic as they split off into tendrils, each one seeking her out. The pit's light flared again, brighter this time, casting the cavern in a deep, blood-red glow. Nor dared to glance over her shoulder and felt her stomach drop. The man was surrounded, his glowing runes flickering as the shadows closed in. He didn't look at her, didn't call for help. He simply stood his ground, his hand outstretched as if holding the tide back. She wanted to scream for him, to tell him to follow her, but her voice caught in her throat. He was buying her time and she couldn't waste it. The shadows were gaining on her, their forms stretching and elongating as they moved with unnatural speed. One of them lunged, a jagged tendril snapping toward her like a whip. She ducked, the movement sending her sprawling onto the cold, hard floor. Pain shot through her palms as they scraped against the stone, but she pushed herself up, adrenaline drowning out the sting. The tendril struck the ground where she had been moments before, leaving a deep gouge in the rock. It pulled back, coiling like a snake preparing to strike again. Nor scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged, and kept running. Ahead, the cavern seemed to narrow, the walls pressing closer together as the red light dimmed. She wasn't sure if it was leading to another tunnel or simply a dead end, but she didn't have time to think. Her legs burned with every step, her body screaming for her to stop, but she forced herself to keep going. The hissing grew louder, the shadows closing in around her. She could feel them now, their presence like a cold wind against her skin. They were so close, too close. And then she saw it, a faint glimmer of light ahead. It was small, barely more than a pinprick in the darkness, but it was enough. She focused on it, willing her legs to move faster, to carry her just a little further. The shadows roared behind her, a guttural sound that reverberated through the cavern. Nor didn't dare look back. She reached the narrowing passage and squeezed through, the rough stone scraping against her arms and legs. The light grew brighter as she pushed forward, the walls closing in until she could barely move. The passage ended abruptly, opening into another chamber. This one was smaller, the walls covered in strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with a faint, golden light. The air here was warmer, the metallic tang replaced by a faint, almost sweet smell. Nor stumbled into the room, her chest heaving as she collapsed to her knees. The shadows stopped at the edge of the passage, their forms writhing as if unable to cross the threshold. They hissed and snapped, their tendrils lashing out but never quite reaching her. Nor stared at them, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. The glowing symbols on the walls seemed to hum softly, their light steady and calming. Nor's breathing began to slow, her racing heart gradually settling. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt a glimmer of hope. But it didn't last. A low growl echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant. Nor's blood turned to ice as she realized the sound wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from behind her. Slowly she turned her head. At first she didn't see anything. The chamber was empty, save for the symbols and the faint light they cast. But then the air shimmered, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, and something began to take shape. It was massive, its form shifting and twisting as though it couldn't quite settle on a single shape. Its eyes glowed with the same reddish light as the pit, and its mouth, if it could even be called that, was a jagged, gaping void. Nor tried to move, tried to run, but her body refused to obey. The thing stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, filling the chamber with an oppressive weight. The glowing symbols on the walls flickered, their light dimming as the creature approached. "You've gone too far," it said, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "There's no escape." Nor forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling. What do you want from me?" she managed to whisper. The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You opened the door," it said. "You let us in. Now you belong to us." "No," Nor said, her voice rising with desperation. "I didn't mean to." "Intentions don't matter," the creature interrupted. "Only actions." It reached out, its massive form looming over her. Nor stumbled back, her hands brushing against the glowing symbols. The warmth of the light seeped into her skin, and she felt a sudden surge of energy. Without thinking, she pressed her palms against the wall, the symbols flaring brightly under her touch. The creature recoiled, its roar shaking the chamber. The shadows at the passage screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke. Nor didn't know what she was doing, but she didn't stop. She pressed harder, the symbols glowing brighter and brighter until the entire chamber was bathed in golden light. The creature roared again, its form flickering and distorting. "This isn't over," it growled, its voice filled with fury. "You can't stop what's coming." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The light in the chamber began to fade, the symbols dimming until they were little more than faint etchings on the walls. Noor collapsed to the floor, her body shaking with exhaustion. She didn't know what had just happened or what the creature's final words meant, but one thing was certain: this nightmare was far from over. Noor sat on the cold floor of the chamber, her back pressed against the wall as her breath came in shallow gasps. The golden glow from the symbols was gone now, leaving only faint traces of their etchings on the smooth surface. The silence was deafening, the absence of the creature's roar almost worse than its presence. She clenched her fists, trying to ground herself, but the fear lingered like a shadow over her mind. "This isn't over," the creature had said. Its voice still echoed in her ears, a promise that clawed at her already fragile sanity. For the first time since this nightmare began, Noor allowed herself to cry. Silent tears streaked her face as the enormity of the situation crushed down on her. Sammy was still out there, lost, alone, or worse. Her family was gone, consumed by the thing she had unleashed. And now she was trapped in this underground maze, hunted by shadows and creatures from her darkest nightmares. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Wiping her tears, Noor forced herself to her feet. The air in the chamber was warmer than the tunnels had been, and though the metallic tang was gone, there was a faint, unsettling vibration in the ground beneath her feet. It was subtle but constant, like a heartbeat. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the walls for any sign of the glowing symbols. They had protected her before, but now they were faint, their power seemingly spent. She reached out and traced her fingers over one of the etchings. It felt cool to the touch, but lifeless like an empty shell. "I need to keep moving," she muttered under her breath. Her voice sounded foreign to her, shaky and hollow. But speaking aloud gave her a sliver of strength, a reminder that she was still alive. The only exit from the chamber was a narrow passage at the far end, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. The walls were rough and jagged, and she had to turn sideways to fit. The vibrations in the ground grew stronger as she moved deeper, the air growing colder with each step. As she emerged into another tunnel, the sound of whispering filled her ears. It was faint at first, like a distant breeze, but it grew louder the further she went. The whispers were indecipherable, a chaotic jumble of voices that overlapped and tangled. "Noor," one of them hissed louder than the others. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice wasn't unfamiliar, it was her mother's. "Noor, come back." Her legs felt rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. She knew it couldn't be real. Her mother was gone. She had seen the shadows take her. But the voice sounded so real, so heartbreakingly familiar. "Stop it," she shouted into the darkness. "You're not her." The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, mocking laugh. It echoed through the tunnel, sending chills down her spine. "You're clever," the voice said, shifting and distorting as it spoke. It was no longer her mother's voice, but something far more sinister. "But cleverness won't save you." Noor didn't respond. She gritted her teeth and kept walking, refusing to let the voice rattle her. But the laughter followed her, growing louder and more menacing with each step. The tunnel began to slope downward, the walls closing in as the air grew colder. The vibrations in the ground were stronger now, almost rhythmic, and the metallic tang had returned, stronger than before. It clung to her skin, making her feel nauseous. As she rounded a corner, the tunnel opened into another cavern. This one was smaller than the last, but its walls were covered in strange, pulsating growths that glowed faintly. They looked like veins, twisting and branching out across the stone like a network of roots. In the center of the cavern was a figure. At first, Noor thought it was a statue, but as she stepped closer, she realized it was moving. It was a woman, hunched over with her back to Noor, her long hair matted and filthy. She wore a tattered dress, and her shoulders rose and fell with each ragged breath. "Sammy?" the woman whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. Noor's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" The woman didn't respond. She slowly turned her head, her movements jerky and unnatural. Noor took a step back as the woman's face came into view. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, and her eyes were hollow sockets, dark and empty. "Sammy?" the woman said again, her voice cracking. "Have you seen my son?" Noor shook her head, her heart pounding. I don't know what you're talking about." The woman took a shuddering step toward her, her movements unsteady. He was here. I know he was here. He was with me, and then they took him. Who took him? Noor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's hollow socket seemed to focus on her, and for a moment, Noor thought she saw a flicker of light in their depths. The ones who feed, the woman said. They take everything. They took my son. And now they're coming for you? Before Noor could respond, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream. It echoed through the cavern, shaking the walls and making the pulsating growths flare with light. Noor stumbled back, covering her ears as the scream grew louder and louder. The woman's body convulsed, her limbs twisting and contorting in impossible ways. The hollow sockets of her eyes began to glow, and a dark, smoke-like substance poured out of her mouth. It rose into the air, coiling like a serpent before shooting toward Noor. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The smoke followed her, its tendrils reaching out like claws. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The tunnel ahead was narrow and uneven, and she nearly tripped as she scrambled through it. The smoke was relentless, its hissing and snapping filling her ears. Noor, the voices whispered. You can't escape. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she ran. The tunnel began to slope upward, and for a moment she thought she saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. But as she rounded the next corner, she skidded to a halt. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a massive chasm. The ground dropped away into darkness, and there was no visible way across. Behind her, the smoke closed in, its tendrils stretching toward her. Noor backed up to the edge of the chasm, her mind racing. She was trapped. The whispers grew louder, the smoke forming into a massive, writhing mass. It loomed over her, its form shifting and twisting as it prepared to strike. And then she saw it, a narrow ledge running along the side of the chasm, barely wide enough for her to stand on. It was risky, but it was her only option. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the ledge, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. The smoke roared, surging toward her as she inched along the ledge, her heart hammering in her chest. The chasm seemed to stretch on forever, the other side lost in darkness. But Noor didn't stop. She kept moving, the sound of the smoke growing fainter behind her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ledge widened, and she found herself on solid ground again. She collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she couldn't rest. Not yet. Somewhere in the darkness, Sammy was still waiting for her. Noor stood at the edge of the chasm, staring into the impenetrable darkness beyond. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body screaming for rest, but she forced herself to keep moving. The whispers had faded, the smoke-like tendrils retreating back into the shadows, but she knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching. Sammy, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm coming. The path ahead was uneven and treacherous, the walls slick with moisture. Each step felt heavier than the last, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger with each passing moment. It was as if the very earth was trying to repel her, to push her back. But she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. The tunnel opened into another cavern, this one larger than any she had seen before. Massive pillars of stone rose from the floor, their surfaces etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint vibration in the ground had grown into a steady, rhythmic pulse. In the center of the cavern was an altar. It was made of black stone, its surface smooth and glistening as if coated in oil. Chains hung from the ceiling above it, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. And lying on the altar, motionless, was Sammy. No? Noor's voice echoed through the cavern as she ran toward the altar. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear and relief battling for dominance. She reached Sammy's side, her hands trembling as she touched his face. Sammy, she said, her voice breaking. Wake up. Please wake up. His skin was cold, his chest still. For one horrifying moment, Noor thought she was too late. But then she felt it, a faint pulse beneath her fingertips, weak but steady. Tears filled her eyes as she shook him gently. Sammy, it's me. It's Noor. Please wake up. His eyelids fluttered, and he let out a weak groan. Noor, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Relief washed over her like a wave, and she pulled him into her arms. I'm here, she said, her voice shaking. I'm here. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. But her relief was short-lived. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the cavern, sending chills down her spine. The pulsing in the ground grew stronger, the air vibrating with an unnatural energy. Nor turned, her arms still wrapped protectively around Sammy, and saw the shadows coalescing at the far end of the cavern. From the darkness, the creature emerged. It was larger than before, its form more solid, more defined. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Nor, and its jagged, gaping mouth twisted into a grotesque semblance of a smile. "You thought you could take him from me?" the creature said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "He belongs to us now." "No," Nor said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her throat. She stood, placing herself between Sammy and the creature. "You can't have him. You've taken enough." The creature laughed again, a sound that made her stomach twist. "You don't understand," it said. "This isn't about taking. This is about balance. You opened the door, and now the scales must be evened." Nor's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. The creature was stalling, toying with her. She looked around the cavern, searching for anything that could help her. The glowing symbols on the pillars caught her attention. They were faint, but they pulsed in time with the vibrations in the ground. "Balance," she said, trying to keep the creature's focus on her. "What kind of balance requires destroying lives?" The creature tilted its head as if amused by her defiance. "You wouldn't understand," it said. "Mortals never do. But it doesn't matter. The price has already been paid." Nor glanced back at the altar, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the chains above it. They weren't just hanging, they were moving, shifting ever so slightly as if alive. Her gaze darted back to the symbols on the pillars. They had protected her before. Maybe they could do it again. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, drawing the creature's attention away from Sammy. "If you want balance," she said, her voice steady, "then take me. Leave him alone." The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You would trade your life for his?" "Yes," Nor said without hesitation. The creature let out a low, rumbling laugh. "How noble," it said. "But it doesn't work that way. The boy is marked. His soul is tied to the door. There's nothing you can do to change that." "We'll see about that," Nor muttered under her breath. Without giving the creature a chance to respond, she ran toward the nearest pillar. The glowing symbols flared as she approached, their light growing brighter. She placed her hands on the surface, the warmth of the symbols seeping into her skin. The creature roared, its form flickering as the light from the symbols intensified. "What are you doing?" it demanded, its voice filled with rage. Nor didn't answer. She closed her eyes, focusing on the symbols. She didn't know how she knew what to do. It was as if the knowledge had been buried deep within her, waiting to be unlocked. The light from the symbols spread, traveling along the veins etched into the cavern walls. The air vibrated with energy, and the ground shook beneath her feet. The chains above the altar rattled, their movements growing more frantic. The creature howled, its form distorting as the light engulfed the cavern. "You don't know what you're doing," it screamed. Nor opened her eyes, her gaze fierce. "Maybe not," she said. "But I'm not letting you take him." The light reached the altar, enveloping Sammy in its glow. The chains snapped, falling to the ground with a deafening crash. The creature let out one final ear-piercing scream before its form dissolved into smoke, swept away by the pulsing energy. As the light began to fade, Nor stumbled back, her body trembling with exhaustion. She collapsed to her knees, her vision swimming. Sammy stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he looked up at her. "Nor," he said, his voice weak but steady. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I told you I'd find you," she said. The cavern was silent now, the oppressive energy gone. The glowing symbols had faded, leaving only faint traces behind. Nor helped Sammy to his feet, her arm wrapped around him as they made their way back toward the tunnel. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. As they reached the tunnel's entrance, Nor glanced back at the altar. The black stone was cracked, its surface dull and lifeless. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something, a faint glowing mark on the back of her hand. The door might have been closed, but it wasn't gone. And somewhere deep in the darkness, something was still watching. It was Halloween night, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the old mansion. The wind howled through the trees, causing the branches to twist and sway like skeletal arms reaching toward the heavens. A full moon lit up the landscape, but there was something unsettling about it tonight. an unnatural chill that seemed to settle in the bones of those who ventured too close. Four friends stood at the front door of the house, staring at it with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. Sam, Lucy, Ben, and Mia had driven out of town, drawn by the rumors of the old house on the hill. Everyone in town had heard the stories. The house had been abandoned for years, and people said it was haunted. Some claimed that strange lights could be seen flickering inside at night, and others whispered about missing persons who had last been seen near the house. But to Sam, Lucy, and Ben, it was just another adventure. Halloween was their favorite night of the year, and this year they had decided to do something different. "We'll just check it out," Sam had said, trying to downplay it. "We'll get a few good scares and then leave." Mia, on the other hand, wasn't so sure. She had heard the stories too, but she hadn't told anyone. She had been to the house before, once when she was much younger. Back then, she had played a similar game with her friends, something she had thought was harmless. But after that night, she had never come back. Now she was torn. She didn't want to spoil the fun for the others, but there was a part of her that knew something was wrong with this place. But Mia wasn't about to be the one to spoil their fun. The four friends stood in front of the mansion, each of them dressed in elaborate Halloween costumes, their breath fogging the cold night air. The house loomed above them like a dark sentinel, its windows staring down at them like empty eyes. "Are we really going in there?" Ben asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. He was dressed as a vampire, his face painted pale with red streaks of makeup dripping from his mouth. His grin was cocky, but his eyes betrayed his growing uncertainty. "You bet we are," Lucy replied, already marching toward the door. She was dressed as a witch, complete with a pointy black hat and a broomstick. Her steps were confident, the excitement of the night filling her. Mia hesitated, standing at the edge of the group, her costume a simple ghost. She tugged nervously at the fabric, glancing at the others. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had never really told them about her previous visit to the house, and now, standing here again, the memories flooded back to her. "We'll be fine, Mia," Lucy said, giving her a playful shove. "It's Halloween, remember? It's all part of the fun." Sam smiled, though his smile was a little less certain than Lucy's. "Yeah, we're just here to get a scare. Nothing too crazy." But Mia didn't feel the same. There was something about the air tonight, something heavy, almost as if the house itself was watching them. She swallowed her unease and followed her friends inside. The door creaked as Lucy pushed it open, revealing the dark, musty interior of the house. The air smelled stale, and the floors creaked under their feet as they stepped inside. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dust settled thick on the furniture, giving the place an almost abandoned, forgotten quality. The walls were lined with old portraits, faded and yellowing with age, staring down at them with lifeless eyes. The living room was eerily silent, save for the sound of their footsteps. Sam shone his flashlight around the room, illuminating old furniture and shelves of books that hadn't been touched in decades. "This place is creepy," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Perfect for Halloween," Lucy quipped, a grin spreading across her face. "Let's get this game started." Mia's heart beat faster. She could feel it now, the sense of wrongness in the air, like a presence was lurking just out of sight. She had told herself that it was just nerves, but something was different about tonight. Sam pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and looked around at the others. "Okay, let's do this," he said, though there was a nervous edge to his voice now. He had heard of the midnight game before, but he hadn't believed the stories about it. He had figured it was just another one of those urban legends that people told around campfires. But now, standing in this house, he wasn't so sure. Mia sighed, looking around nervously. "Are you sure about this?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, Mia," Ben said, slapping her lightly on the back. "Don't be such a buzzkill. It's just a stupid game. Nothing's going to happen." The game was simple, as Lucy explained. They would write their names on pieces of paper, burn them with the candle, and then walk around the house. The game didn't end until midnight, and if they stopped, they risked angering whatever spirit haunted the house. The instructions were simple. Don't stop moving and don't break the circle. One by one, they wrote their names on the paper. Sam, Lucy, Ben, and Mia. Sam watched as the others burned their papers in the candle flame, and then, hesitantly, he burned his own. The flickering light of the candle danced across their faces as they held their breath, watching the paper curl and blacken. A strange, almost imperceptible chill ran through the room. Sam shivered. Okay, he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Let's get this over with. They blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. Their breath came out in visible puffs as they moved into the hallway, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. The house was cold, unnaturally cold, like something was drawing all the warmth from the air. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching them with malevolent eyes. Ben pushed ahead, trying to act unfazed. I'm going to check out the basement, he said, already moving down the hallway. You guys coming? I'll pass, Lucy said, laughing nervously. I'm not that brave. Sam looked at Mia, who was trailing behind them. Her face was pale, and she seemed almost lost in thought. Mia, you okay? He asked, his voice soft. Mia swallowed, glancing over her shoulder. I don't know. This feels wrong, Sam. But Sam didn't say anything in response. He was already moving forward, feeling the excitement of the game start to take over. They moved deeper into the house, each step bringing them closer to something they couldn't see, something that was waiting for them in the shadows. They reached the living room again, and the temperature had dropped even further. Sam's breath fogged in the air, and his skin prickled with the cold. We need to finish this, he said, his voice tight with nerves. It's almost midnight. Suddenly there was a loud creak, like something heavy was shifting in the house. The door to the kitchen slammed open. Sam flinched, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I'm not going in there, Ben muttered, backing away. No way. Let's just go, Lucy said, grabbing Sam's arm. We're done. Let's get out of here. But just as they turned to leave, a whisper, soft and unintelligible, echoed through the hall. Mia froze, her body stiffening. Did you hear that? Sam turned quickly. It's just the wind, he said, his voice shaking. But then it happened again. The whisper grew louder, clearer. A voice, raspy and distant, but unmistakable. Leave, now. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. The walls seemed to close in on them, pressing in from every side. And then, from the corner of the room, a dark shape began to shift. Lucy screamed. The dark figure was tall and thin, its body twisted and distorted like a human shape, but not quite. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, empty of life, staring at them with malevolent intent. The figure moved, and before anyone could react, it lunged at Mia. Mia! Sam shouted, reaching for her, but she was already gone, pulled into the darkness. Her scream echoed in the hallway, and then, silence. The door slammed shut behind them. The door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the entire house. Sam, Lucy, and Ben stood there, frozen in place, the sound of Mia's scream still echoing in their ears. Sam's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He turned to look at Lucy, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. What just happened? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Sam replied, feeling the weight of the fear settle in his chest. Mia, she was pulled away. He tried to move, but his legs felt as though they were made of stone, his body locked in place by sheer terror. Mia! Lucy shouted, as though hoping that calling out would somehow bring her back. Mia, where are you? There was no response. Only silence. Sam swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in his throat. We need to find her. We can't leave without her. Ben shook his head frantically. No way. That thing, whatever that was, it had her. There's nothing we can do. His voice cracked, and he looked like he might be on the verge of a breakdown. We have to get out of here. We have to leave. Sam knew Ben was right. They couldn't just stand there and hope that Mia would return. The house felt alive, its dark corners seeming to swallow every shred of light, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on them as they stood in that suffocating silence. No, Sam said, his voice firm despite the terror rising in his chest. We're not leaving without her. We'll find a way to bring her back. He didn't know why he said it, whether it was because he believed it or because he needed something to hold on to. But in that moment, the idea of leaving without Mia felt impossible. He wouldn't abandon her. Sam, Lucy's voice was barely audible, a tremor in her words. What if she's gone? What if we can't help her? I don't care, Sam replied, his determination hardening. He turned, his eyes scanning the dark hallway in search of any clue, any sign of Mia. We'll keep looking. We'll find her. But as he stepped forward, the house itself seemed to react. A low, eerie hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. The shadows shifted unnaturally, and the temperature dropped even further, biting into their skin. The floor creaked beneath their feet as though the house was alive, responding to their every movement. Sam glanced around, searching for any hint of where Mia had gone, but everything felt wrong. The house had changed since they first entered. It had become darker, more oppressive, as though it was aware of their every step, watching them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his heart pounded harder with every passing second. The whispering began again. At first, it was faint, a low murmur barely discernible above the sound of their own breathing. But it grew louder, more urgent, until the voices surrounded them, a chorus of hushed, rasping voices that seemed to come from all directions. Leave, stay, forever. The words were fragmented, disjointed, but they carried a weight of warning, of threat. Sam spun around, his flashlight flickering in his hand as he tried to make sense of the voices. They were coming from everywhere. Stop it, Ben whispered, his voice cracking. He clutched his chest as though trying to hold his breath in. This is insane. We're going to die in here. We need to go. No? Sam shouted, shaking his head. We're not going anywhere until we find Mia. He pushed forward even as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The temperature plummeted, frost gathering on the edges of the walls, the air biting at their skin. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and warping, creating strange shapes that danced at the edge of Sam's vision. They reached the staircase, its wooden steps creaking under their weight. Sam didn't stop. He didn't know why he was pushing forward. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave, but his feet carried him forward as though the house itself was pulling him, urging him toward the heart of the darkness. The stairs groaned beneath them as they climbed, and as they reached the second floor, a sharp, cold gust of wind slammed into them, causing them to stagger backward. The door at the end of the hallway slammed open, revealing a dark room at the far end. Sam's flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, he saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was Mia. Her eyes were wide, vacant, her skin pale as death. She stood motionless, her body unnaturally still, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hand was raised, pointing directly at Sam. Mia? Sam called out, his voice trembling. He reached forward, his hand outstretched. Mia, it's me, Sam. We're here to help you. But Mia's eyes were not her own. They were black, empty pits that seemed to consume everything around them. Her body jerked forward, moving in unnatural, jagged motions, like a marionette being controlled by an unseen force. No? Lucy whispered, her face ashen. That's not her anymore. It's not Mia. A cold laugh echoed through the room, and the walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The voice was low and guttural, but unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere, surrounding them. The game is not over, it rasped. You cannot leave. You cannot escape. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as the figure of Mia began to move toward him, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She moved with eerie grace, too fast, too precise. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, a mockery of the girl they once knew. Ben stepped back, stumbling in fear. This is it. We're going to die. We should have left when we had the chance. Sam's mind raced. He had to do something. There had to be a way to break the game, to stop whatever force had taken hold of Mia, to end this nightmare. He remembered the rules, the midnight game. The game only ended at midnight. But it was past midnight now, wasn't it? Wasn't it? The clock on the wall struck with a deep, reverberating chime. Sam's blood ran cold. It wasn't over yet. The game hadn't ended, but it was too late. The shadows closed in around them, suffocating the air. The whispers grew into a maddening roar, drowning out all other sound. Sam could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, something powerful that had been waiting for them. And then Mia lunged. Sam never saw what happened next. The world went dark as the house consumed them, one by one, leaving only silence behind. The house stood empty once more, the wind howling through its broken windows. The midnight game had claimed its victims, and the house waited, quietly, until the next souls dared to enter. And the game would begin again. This ending ties together the fear and tension of the haunted house, wrapping up the story with an unsettling, cyclical nature. The house doesn't let go, and the consequences of the midnight game are far more horrific than any of them could have imagined. The fate of the characters is sealed, leaving the door open for future players who might challenge the game again.